In the candlelit parlors and mirrored boudoirs of 18th-century Europe, beauty was a form of currency, and every feature of the face could be refined, shaped, or enhanced to match the ideals of the age. Skin was powdered until it glowed pale as porcelain. Lips were tinted like ripe cherries. Hair was sculpted into towers of powdered curls. But amid this elaborate artistry, one small yet powerful detail could determine the entire harmony of a face: the eyebrows. In a century obsessed with symmetry, proportion, and the silent language of the gaze, the perfect brow was more than decoration. It was an emblem of refinement. It was a frame that defined one's character at first glance. And so it should not surprise us, though it may amuse or unsettle, that the women, and occasionally men, of this gilded age turned to one of the most peculiar materials imaginable to perfect their brows: mouse skin. At first, the very phrase seems absurd, even grotesque. Yet to the fashionable elite of London, Paris, and Vienna, the concept was a practical marriage of necessity and ingenuity. Natural eyebrows were fragile things. They thinned with age, were lost to illness, or were sacrificed to overzealous tweezing in the pursuit of fashionable shapes. Accidents, too, played their part. Overheated curling irons for hair could singe them off in an instant. And so, much as wigs had long served to restore or transform the hair, false eyebrows stepped in to rescue the brow. Of all the available materials, mouse skin, delicate, supple, and endowed with a fine, natural fur, proved to be unexpectedly ideal. Its tiny pelts could be shaped and dyed, the fur mimicking the softness and subtle sheen of human brows in a way that coarse animal hairs could not. The 18th century was no stranger to animal-derived beauty aids. Whalebone stiffened corsets, red carmine from crushed cochineal insects tinted lips and cheeks, and silk from worms adorned gowns. But the eyebrow trade was different, more intimate, more whimsical, and perhaps more morbid. To wear mouse skin upon one's face was to engage in a strange union of the living and the artificial, a small but vivid reminder of the era's fascination with transforming nature into ornament. The look was not born in a single city nor from a single mind. Rather, it emerged in that swirling transnational current of ideas, goods, and tastes that connected the courts of Versailles and St. James, the coffee houses of Paris, and the opera boxes of Vienna. Contemporary satirists found rich material here. Caricatures in broadsheets lampooned the fashion, sketching powdered ladies with rodents scampering across their foreheads. Playwrights dropped sly lines about borrowing whiskers from the pantry. Yet the fact that such satire was effective proves just how widespread the practice had become. It was no obscure eccentricity, but an accepted, if curious, part of the toilette for many. The craft itself required skill. Skinners and wigmakers trimmed the tiny pelts to match fashionable shapes, often arching high to elongate the eye. Some were adhered with spirit gum or a mixture of beeswax and resin. Others were sewn lightly onto fine silk strips for easy placement. Colors ranged from jet black to soft chestnut, and in some cases were tinted with the same vegetable dyes used for hairpieces. There is a paradox here that says much about the 18th century mind. On the one hand, the Enlightenment was reshaping Europe with its insistence on reason, science, and the rejection of superstition. On the other, the same salons that debated Newtonian optics might host women who that very morning had pressed the skin of a field mouse to their brow. Beauty was not exempt from the age's contradictions. It was an era when human ingenuity seemed boundless, when even the smallest imperfection was an opportunity for invention. The eyebrow, perched between utility and luxury, became a tiny canvas for the most unexpected of artistic materials. In the chapters that follow, we will trace the strange journey of this fashion, from the vermin-filled cellars where the raw material was gathered, to the ateliers where artisans coaxed it into delicate arcs, to the glittering ballrooms where it completed the transformation of Europe's most envied beauties. We will meet the women whose brows became the envy of a continent, the satirists who mocked them, and the merchants who quietly built fortunes from the humblest of skins. Along the way, we will see how this small detail reflects the deeper currents of the 18th century, its appetite for novelty, its comfort with artifice, and its willingness to turn even the most unlikely of creatures into an accessory in the theater of human display. Before mouse skin ever brushed the brow of a duchess or the powdered forehead of an actress, the eyebrow had already lived a long and shifting life in the annals of European beauty. The 18th century did not invent the notion that the brow could be perfected. It merely carried that notion into stranger territories. To understand the rise of the mouse skin eyebrow, we must first look at the eyebrow as it existed in the cultural imagination of Europe before this peculiar material made its debut, for the arch of the brow had been a canvas for ideals, fears, and desires for centuries. In the late 17th century, the Restoration Court of Charles II in England, and the contemporaneous reign of Louis XIV in France, saw beauty become both a personal pursuit and a public performance. Eyebrows, though small, played a critical part in this performance. In an era before photography, the face was experienced primarily in motion, and the brow was the most articulate frame to the eyes, the seat of emotion and allure. Portraitists of the Baroque and early Rococo lingered over the curve and shading of brows, knowing that a faint upward sweep could lend nobility, while a straighter line could suggest intelligence or steadiness. Eyebrows were drawn, darkened, or even lightened with burnt clove ash or lampblack, mixed with animal fats or plant oils to make a crude cosmetic paste. Fashion, of course, is never static. The early 18th century inherited from its predecessor a fondness for soft, high-arched brows, echoing the curves of the wigs and hairpieces that were rising skyward above them. Women who had naturally thick brows often plucked them into the desired arc, though not with the modern precision we imagine today. Over-plucking was common, whether through enthusiasm or through the slow, irreversible thinning caused by repeated hair removal. There were no serums to coax them back, no brow pencils to fill them in, and so the early part of the century already saw a market for artificial enhancements. In aristocratic circles, where artifice was a badge of refinement rather than deceit, the use of patches, wigs, and hairpieces was not just accepted but celebrated. False eyebrows made of human hair, sewn onto silk, were available in some urban markets, though they were costly and difficult to match to one's complexion. They also lacked the fine taper and sheen of natural brows, and in candlelight could look stiff or unnatural. Yet, they represented an important step in the lineage that would eventually make mouse skin seem logical. The idea that a feature of the human face could be replaced, altered, or entirely reinvented with an artificial piece. The 18th century was also a time when health and beauty were intertwined in complex, sometimes contradictory ways. Smallpox scars, accidents from open flames or hot irons, and the ravages of disease often altered the face in ways that fashion sought to disguise. Eyebrows could be casualties of both illness and cure. Treatments for fevers or certain skin conditions might involve caustic substances that damaged hair follicles. Fashionable lead-based face paints sometimes caused hair loss around the temples and brows. In this environment, the loss of eyebrows was not rare, and the willingness to replace them artificially was born of necessity as much as vanity. Culturally, the eyebrow also carried a weight of symbolism. In the literature of the age, brows were shorthand for mood and moral character. A knit brow implied sternness. A raised brow implied surprise or disdain. Well-formed brows were signs of beauty, even if the rest of the face was less than ideal. In an era obsessed with physiognomy, the pseudoscience that claimed a person's character could be read from their facial features. The brow's shape and placement were thought to reveal qualities like honesty, sensuality, or cunning. To alter the brow, then, was not just to change one's appearance. It was to rewrite the visible script of the self. This pre-mouse skin period also reveals the shifting boundaries between what was considered acceptable artifice and what crossed into the realm of deception. Wigs, for example, were widely worn by both sexes, but a wig was a public, almost theatrical object. Its artificiality was part of its social function. False eyebrows, however, were intimate, almost clandestine. They could betray the wearer if they slipped, if adhesive failed in the heat of a ballroom, or if the wrong angle of candlelight revealed their falsity. Such potential embarrassment meant that early adopters of artificial brows were careful, relying on skilled artisans who understood both the mechanics of adhesion and the subtleties of matching color and texture. It is here, in this early 18th century matrix of necessity, artistry, and symbolism, that the stage was set for the arrival of mouse skin. Urbanization was creating a new class of artisans who specialized in niche beauty trades. Wig makers, patch makers, and those who crafted beauty spots from silk or velvet. The same networks that supplied hair for wigs could, in theory, supply animal pelts for eyebrows. But it would take a particular leap of imagination, or perhaps simple pragmatism, to realize that the skin of a small rodent could be transformed into a convincing facial feature. Moreover, the eyebrow was uniquely suited to such an innovation. Unlike a wig, which had to cover a large area, or a patch, which was obviously decorative, a false brow needed only to blend seamlessly into the surrounding skin and hair. Mouse fur, being fine, short, and naturally aligned on the pelt, offered a texture almost uncanny in its resemblance to human brow hair. It could be cut into precise shapes without losing the alignment of the hairs, and the skin itself was thin enough to sit close to the wearer's own without creating a noticeable ridge. These properties made it superior to human hair brows, which required sewing onto a base that could be bulky. Before this idea took hold, however, the eyebrow occupied a curious space in the hierarchy of beauty concerns. It was important, yes, but secondary to the powdered coiffure, the complexion, and the fashionable dress. It was a detail that could make or break a look, but it did not yet inspire the same obsessive attention it would later command. The rise of the mouse skin eyebrow would change that, turning the brow from a subtle frame into a focal point of fashion conversation, satire, and even moral judgment. In the years leading up to the trend, there were hints of its coming in the growing willingness to incorporate animal materials into intimate parts of the toilette. Beauty manuals of the early century mention using fine furs to augment lashes or brows, though without specifying the animal. Some even suggested using thin strips of vellum covered in fine down. These were clumsy compared to what was to come, but they reflect a growing comfort with the idea that the body could be subtly augmented with carefully crafted additions, and that such additions were not shameful but sophisticated, provided they were executed with taste. Thus, by the time mouse skin entered the scene in the mid to late 18th century, the cultural groundwork had been laid. The eyebrow was recognized as a vital component of facial beauty. The loss of it was common enough to demand solutions, and the use of animal products in beauty was widely accepted. All that was needed was a material that could deliver realism, flexibility, and novelty in equal measure. The humble mouse, a creature otherwise relegated to the shadows of kitchens and cellars, was about to step, albeit unwillingly, into the most refined spaces of Europe, perched upon the brows of its most fashionable inhabitants. The emergence of the mouse skin eyebrow in 18th century Europe was not a spontaneous whim, but the culmination of intersecting trends, materials, and social conditions that made the improbable seem not only possible, but desirable. To modern sensibilities, the notion of wearing a strip of rodent skin above one's eyes may seem grotesque, yet in its own time, it was hailed as a small marvel of ingenuity, a practical and fashionable solution to a genuine problem, delivered with the finesse of the age's finest artisans. The mouse skin eyebrow, as it would come to be known, was born in an age when artifice was a virtue, not a vice. The powdered wig, the beauty patch, the painted cheek, these were not disguises but enhancements, public declarations of taste, wealth, and sophistication. This was an era that saw little contradiction in celebrating both nature's gifts and human craft's ability to improve upon them. To arrive at the mouse skin eyebrow, one only needed to accept a few truths of the time: that hair was a movable, purchasable commodity, that the body was a site for artistic intervention, and that small animals, being abundant and inexpensive, could provide useful raw materials for adornment. The origins of the practice are shrouded in partial records and scattered anecdotes. Surviving beauty manuals from the mid-18th century occasionally reference faux brows of fine pelt, without naming the source. It is in satirical prints and whispered salon gossip that we find the first unmistakable nods to mouse skin. Caricatures from the 1750s and 1760s in London and Paris depict fashionable women at their dressing tables, a maid delicately applying what is clearly a thin, arched strip of fur to her mistress's brow. In sum, the caption leaves no doubt. Her grace receives her mousy charms. Why mouse? The answer lies in a confluence of practical qualities and economic realities. Mouse fur is short, fine, and lies naturally in one direction, making it remarkably similar in texture to human eyebrow hair. Unlike longer animal furs, it requires little to no trimming to achieve the desired length. The pelts themselves are small, making them easy to handle and shape, and their thinness allows them to adhere closely to the skin without creating an unnatural thickness. Mice were also readily available, caught in traps in kitchens, barns, and city streets, and their bodies were already being put to various utilitarian purposes, from feeding animals to being dissected in natural philosophy experiments. In this context, turning mouse skin into an eyebrow was less an act of eccentricity than one of resourcefulness. The process of creating a mouse skin brow was surprisingly meticulous. The artisan, sometimes a wig maker, sometimes a specialist in beauty accessories, would select a pelt with the appropriate coloration, usually shades of brown, gray, or black. The skin was cleaned, cured, and treated to prevent decay, then cut into the desired shape with careful attention to symmetry and the natural curve of fashionable brows. Some were mounted on a barely visible strip of fine gauze for easier handling, though the most expensive examples dispensed with any backing at all, relying on the natural integrity of the skin to hold its form. Adhesion was achieved with a variety of substances, from gum arabic to fish glue, the same materials used for attaching false beauty patches. At first, mouse skin eyebrows were primarily a solution for those who had lost their natural brows through illness, over-plucking, or age. Smallpox, still a scourge in the 18th century, could leave faces scarred and hairless, and treatments for various fevers sometimes resulted in hair loss. In such cases, a realistic false brow was not merely decorative. It restored a sense of normalcy and confidence. For widows or older women returning to public life after a period of seclusion, such enhancements could be part of a deliberate re-entry into society's gaze. However, as with so many beauty innovations, what began as a corrective quickly became a fashionable embellishment in its own right. In the competitive world of aristocratic and theatrical beauty, where novelty was prized, mouse skin brows offered an opportunity to exaggerate the perfect arch, to darken the frame of the eyes, to create expressions that nature alone might not have provided. Women who already had brows sometimes shaved or plucked them away entirely to replace them with more flattering shapes in mouse fur. The fact that such brows could be removed and reapplied at will meant that a woman could adjust her expression from day to day. A higher arch for the opera, a softer curve for a daytime promenade. The spread of the trend was fueled by the dense social networks of European capitals. In Paris, London, and Vienna, beauty was a public affair, displayed in theaters, at court, and in salons where women and men alike competed for attention. Word of a novel cosmetic traveled quickly among the elite, often carried by actresses and courtesans who moved between social spheres. Stage performers were particularly quick to adopt mouse skin brows, as they held their shape under hot stage lights and could be made dramatically arched to suit theatrical roles. Not everyone was enchanted. As early as the 1760s, moralists and satirists took aim at the fashion. Some pamphlets warned of the indignity of losing one's brows mid-conversation if the glue failed in warm weather. Others hinted darkly at hygiene concerns, suggesting that the pelts might carry disease, a claim for which there is little evidence, but which played into broader anxieties about the use of animal materials. Hogarth's satirical prints occasionally included a lady's brow slipping askew, a small visual joke at the expense of vanity. In the coffee houses and pamphlet wars of the day, the mouse skin brow became a shorthand for the excesses of cosmetic artifice. Yet ridicule could not halt its spread. By the 1770s, high-end beauty suppliers in Paris advertised sourcils de peau fine, eyebrows of fine skin, in a range of shapes and shades, with some even offering seasonal collections to match the prevailing coiffure styles. London's Bond Street and the Strand had their own purveyors, who claimed to use only the freshest pelts, and who sometimes tinted the fur to suit a client's complexion. Prices varied, with the most basic sets affordable to the aspiring middle class, while the finest examples, made from perfectly matched, rare-colored pelts, were the preserve of the wealthy. The mouse skin brow also intersected with the Enlightenment's fascination with natural philosophy and taxonomy. Naturalists who studied animal physiology were well aware of the properties of mouse fur, and some even wrote approvingly of its use in cosmetics as a kind of applied science. In an age when taxonomy was classifying the natural world with unprecedented rigor, the idea that one could catalog and utilize every part of an animal, even for beauty, was part of a broader ethos of mastery over nature. By the final decades of the century, the mouse skin brow had become enough of a fixture that it appeared in inventories of personal effects, alongside wigs, ribbons, and beauty spots. Some women kept multiple sets in ornate cases, switching them out to match outfits, much as they might change fans or gloves. Others wore them daily, so seamlessly integrated into their appearance that acquaintances may never have known they were artificial. In hindsight, the birth of the mouse skin eyebrow tells us as much about the 18th century mind as it does about its aesthetics. It reveals a culture that prized ingenuity over squeamishness, that saw beauty as a field for technical innovation, and that embraced the porous boundary between the natural and the artificial. It also foreshadows later developments in fashion and cosmetics, where materials from across the animal kingdom, and later, the synthetic world, would be harnessed in the name of enhancement. The mouse skin brow was, in its way, a small Enlightenment project, a problem identified, a solution engineered, a product refined and disseminated through social networks. That it happened to involve the skin of a humble rodent only added to its curious charm, a detail that future generations would seize upon as emblematic of the eccentricities of the age. But in its own time, it was neither bizarre nor laughable. It was simply one more expression of the 18th century's relentless pursuit of the ideal face, framed in fur as finely arched as any artist's brush could draw. By the latter half of the 18th century, the mouse skin eyebrow had slipped quietly from novelty to fixture, from whispered curiosity to an adornment that could be found in the toilette cabinets of duchesses and merchant wives alike. Its journey from Parisian salons to the far reaches of the European world was not unlike the spread of tea, silk, or printed satire. Born along the arteries of empire, carried by ships and carriages, and given fresh life wherever ambition, vanity, and social performance converged. To understand how a strip of cured rodent fur became a symbol of cultivated elegance across continents, one must look to the geopolitical and cultural scaffolding of the era. Europe in the 1770s and 1780s was a network of courts, colonies, and mercantile hubs linked by trade routes that carried not only goods but ideas, fashions, and habits. The powdered wig, once a specifically French court accessory, had by this time crossed borders with ease. So too had the art of portrait miniatures, Italian opera, and the wearing of beauty patches. In such a climate, the mouse skin brow was well positioned to travel. Its first great leap beyond its Paris and London strongholds came through diplomacy. Ambassadors' wives, accustomed to carrying their toilette rituals with them, brought mouse skin brows to foreign courts. In Vienna, the Empress Maria Theresa's circle, while conservative in dress, nonetheless dabbled in the accessory for masked balls and theatrical performances. In Madrid, the Bourbon court found them particularly suited to the dramatic gestures of Spanish aristocratic fashion, where the eyes were already emphasized by dark lace mantillas. By the 1780s, Italian duchesses in Turin and Florence were ordering brows from Parisian suppliers, smuggled in trunks alongside ribbons and imported perfumes. Colonial networks amplified the trend further. The Caribbean, with its plantation wealth and constant traffic to and from European ports, became a surprising node for the trade. Wealthy planter families, eager to replicate metropolitan fashions, ordered not only gowns and wigs, but complete cosmetic kits from London merchants. Surviving shipping records occasionally list false brows among items destined for Bridgetown, Kingston, and Havana. In such humid climates, the practicality of a removable brow, one that could be stored away and readhered, was, ironically, an advantage. Though mouse skin's delicate texture suffered in tropical air, enterprising ladies found ways to preserve them, storing them with cloves or lavender to ward off pests. Theaters, as ever, were crucibles of dissemination. Traveling troops carried the fashion from city to city, their leading ladies wearing dramatic, high-arched mouse fur brows visible even from the back rows. Playbills and gossip columns noted their striking stage faces, and audiences, particularly in port cities, took notice. In some cases, actresses sold worn pairs to admirers or to local beauty suppliers, creating a secondary market. The theater thus became both a showcase and a distribution point, blurring the line between costume and everyday fashion. As the mouse skin brow spread, its meaning shifted subtly to match local sensibilities. In Paris, it was a technical marvel and a mark of refined artifice. In London, a witty accessory that could signal either high fashion or a satirical jab at it. In colonial capitals, it was a badge of metropolitan connection. The same strip of fur, worn in Lisbon, could evoke courtly restraint, while in Port-au-Prince it might be read as an overt declaration of status, proof that one's household had the means to import the latest novelties from Europe. Economics played a role in its expansion as well. The preparation of mouse skin brows did not require large workshops or costly tools, making it a trade accessible to small-scale artisans. Wigmakers' apprentices, seamstresses, and even furriers experimented with producing them, sometimes from locally trapped rodents when imports were too costly. In port cities where goods from Europe arrived sporadically, local production filled the gaps, and manuals describing the cleaning, cutting, and shaping process circulated quietly among those in the beauty trades. This localization of production also meant variations emerged. In the Dutch East Indies, brows were sometimes made from the fur of local rodents whose coats had a glossier sheen than European mice. In parts of Germany, craftsmen experimented with squirrel fur, which, when finely trimmed, offered a similar texture but a warmer hue. Purists insisted that only true mouse skin achieved the necessary delicacy, but practicality often overrode orthodoxy, especially in remote outposts. Art and portraiture document this proliferation. Miniature portraits from the last quarter of the century, particularly in England and France, show women with sharply defined, symmetrical brows that bear the telltale uniformity of artificial construction. In some cases, the painter's brush captures the faint edge of the skin, a barely perceptible line above the natural brow ridge. These portraits, intended as accurate records of appearance, are silent testimony to how normalized the accessory had become. Critics, of course, followed the trend's expansion with relish. The satirical press in London lampooned not only the ladies who wore mouse skin brows, but also the men who admired them. One widely circulated caricature depicted a foppish gentleman so entranced by a lady's brows that he failed to notice them slide into his teacup. In Paris, revolutionary pamphleteers would later seize on such frivolities as evidence of aristocratic decadence, contrasting them with the natural, unadorned faces of the virtuous citizen. Despite these jabs, the brow retained its appeal well into the final years of the Ancien Regime. Part of its endurance lay in its adaptability. Just as wigs evolved from towering, powdered confections to more naturalistic styles in the 1780s, mouse skin brows shifted to subtler shapes and colors. The heavy, high arches of mid-century gave way to softer curves, designed to suggest a return to nature while still relying on artifice. This ability to track and echo broader fashion currents kept the brow from becoming an obvious relic even as tastes changed. There is an irony in the way the mouse skin brow mirrored the very empires that spread it. Both were built on networks of exchange, both adapted to local conditions, and both carried with them the contradictions of refinement and exploitation. Just as colonial wealth depended on the labor and resources of distant lands, so too did this small cosmetic rely on the humble bodies of creatures trapped in kitchens and fields, transformed by human craft into objects of desire. In both cases, the finished product, whether a palace facade or a perfectly arched brow, concealed the material realities of its creation. By the close of the 18th century, the mouse skin brow was no longer merely a Parisian curiosity. It was a shared reference across a vast geography. From St. Petersburg's icy courts to the candlelit salons of Lima, it signaled participation in a transnational conversation about beauty, identity, and modernity. That it could cross such boundaries is a testament to the peculiar power of small things in shaping the texture of an age. Its prominence also set the stage for the debates to come. As Enlightenment ideals began to challenge inherited hierarchies and as revolutions erupted on both sides of the Atlantic, the question of what constituted natural beauty would become increasingly politicized. The mouse skin brow, for all its lightness and frivolity, would find itself caught in this crossfire, its very existence prompting reflection on the balance between artifice and authenticity. The fashion that had once been celebrated in gilded chambers would soon be scrutinized in the harsh light of new political realities. For now, however, at the height of its imperial spread, the mouse skin brow remained secure in its place. It had traveled far from its birthplace, adapting to climates, customs, and economies with the quiet resilience of the very animal from which it was made. Like the empire itself, it seemed, at least for a time, impossible to imagine the world without it. If the 18th century adored its mouse skin eyebrows for their visual effect, it revered them no less for the skill and craft that brought them into being. Behind every perfectly arched, delicately feathered brow that graced a salon mirror or stage spotlight lay a small, but intricate industry, one that blended artisanal ingenuity, material opportunism, and the interconnected economies of European trade. Like the hidden carpenters of Versailles or the seamstresses of Spitalfields, the makers of faux brows worked mostly in obscurity, their craft appreciated only in the finished flourish above a lady's eyes. The process began with the material itself, which was far from the glamorous image it later assumed. Mouse pelts were humble, common, and often considered refuse. Yet in the hands of a skilled artisan, these scraps became something both delicate and desirable. Sources of supply varied. Urban centers relied on professional trappers who cleared vermin from warehouses, mills, and kitchens, while rural makers often obtained their pelts from farmsteads where mice were an inevitable nuisance. In Paris, there was even quiet competition between furriers who specialized in fine gloves or muffs and the brow makers who sought the smallest, smoothest sections of fur. The choicest mouse skins came from young, healthy animals whose fur was short, even, and free of damage, a rarity that demanded both patience and good supplier relationships. Once acquired, the pelts required careful preparation. First, they were cleaned with gentle lime solutions to remove oils and impurities, a stage that had to be timed with precision. Too little, and the fur would retain a greasy weight. Too much, and the skin would grow brittle and prone to tearing. Artisans spoke of a living softness that had to be preserved, for a stiff brow betrayed its artificiality at once. After cleaning, the pelts were stretched on small wooden frames and dried slowly, often in shaded rooms where air could circulate without harsh sunlight. This stage, though unglamorous, was essential. Improperly dried skins warped, making it impossible to cut a symmetrical brow. Shaping the brow was both science and art. Templates made of parchment or thin copper guided the cutting process, allowing makers to produce consistent arches that matched prevailing fashions. In mid-century France, the favored brow was high, slender, and elegantly curved, requiring precise trimming of the fur to avoid bulkiness. In England by the 1780s, a slightly fuller, straighter brow came into vogue, echoing a taste for what was marketed as a more natural look. Makers adjusted their templates accordingly, and cosmopolitan customers sometimes kept multiple sets to suit changing trends or the mood of a given evening. Color, too, required subtle mastery. Not all mouse fur matched the wearer's hair or complexion, and a stark contrast could ruin the illusion. Artisans employed an array of dyes: walnut husk for rich browns, logwood for deep black, saffron or chamomile for warm golden tones. Achieving a believable hue demanded knowledge of how each dye interacted with the natural oils in the fur. Overdyeing could strip the fur of its sheen, underdyeing left it patchy. Some elite workshops, notably those in Paris's Rue Saint-Honoré, kept guarded formulas for their dyes, passing them only to trusted apprentices. Adhering the finished brows was another arena of innovation. The simplest method used a paste of gum arabic and rosewater, applied sparingly to the skin side of the brow before positioning it above the wearer's natural brow line. This paste dried clear and held securely for several hours, yet could be dissolved with a warm cloth without damaging the skin beneath. Wealthier clients commissioned brows mounted on fine silk gauze, which allowed for an even more secure application and easier removal. A few ambitious makers even experimented with self-adhering brows coated in a thin layer of mastic that could be warmed between the fingers to activate its stickiness, an early flirtation with convenience cosmetics. The workshops themselves varied in scale. Some were little more than a corner of a wigmaker's establishment, with a single journeyman dedicated to the task. Others grew into specialized ateliers that employed multiple workers, each handling a different stage. One cleaned and prepared pelts, another cut and shaped, a third dyed, while the master artisan oversaw quality and dealt directly with clients. In Paris, certain ateliers became fashionable destinations in their own right, their names appearing in society columns alongside modistes and perfumers. Clients visited not merely to purchase, but to be seen purchasing, for the act itself became a small performance of taste and modernity. Economic records, where they survive, show that the faux brow trade was modest but steady. A well-made pair could command the equivalent of several days' wages for a laborer, placing them firmly in the luxury goods category. Yet they were not unattainable. Cheaper versions made from coarser fur or produced in bulk were available through apothecaries and general merchants. This stratification mirrored the broader cosmetics market, where rouge, powder, and scent existed in both elite and popular forms. Guild structures also shaped the trade. In France, brow-making was not recognized as a separate guild, so practitioners often operated under the umbrella of the wigmakers or mercers' guilds. This lack of formal recognition meant fewer legal protections, but also fewer restrictions, allowing for more experimentation. In England, where guild influence was waning, independent makers flourished in the informal networks of Covent Garden and the Strand, selling directly to customers or through milliners who bundled brows with other accessories. Marketing played a critical role in sustaining demand. Newspaper advertisements promised natural arches restored, or the perfect expression of vivacity and grace. Some targeted older women whose thinning brows betrayed their age, offering the illusion of youthful fullness. Others pitched to younger customers, suggesting that a precisely shaped arch could enhance flirtation by framing the eyes to greater effect. Theatrical endorsements were especially powerful. When a celebrated actress in Drury Lane was rumored to have won a wealthy suitor's heart in part through her mouse-furred glances, sales in London reportedly surged. Beyond the commercial sphere, the craft of brow-making intersected with broader cultural and philosophical debates. The Enlightenment's fascination with nature and artifice found a curious case study in the mouse skin brow. Writers in journals like the Ladies' Magazine debated whether enhancing one's features through such means was a harmless expression of taste or a deceit that undermined authentic beauty. Some moralists condemned it outright, linking it to vanity and moral decay. Others defended it as a legitimate form of self-presentation, no more dishonest than a well-tailored gown or a powdered wig. The industry also adapted to geopolitical disruptions. During wartime, when trade routes faltered, shortages of imported dyes or fine tools forced artisans to improvise. In Britain during the American Revolutionary War, for example, some makers turned to locally sourced plant dyes and simplified designs to keep costs down. Conversely, periods of peace and prosperity allowed for bursts of innovation. Experiments with different animal furs, new adhesive formulas, and even decorative embellishments like tiny seed pearls or gold thread woven into the brow for masquerade costumes. By the close of the century, the faux brow industry had matured into a discreet but persistent presence in Europe's beauty economy. It lacked the flamboyance of wig-making or the intoxicating allure of perfumery, yet it endured because it satisfied a precise need: the ability to reshape one of the face's most expressive features with minimal effort and maximum effect. The artisans who supplied this need were, in their way, quiet alchemists, transforming the mundane remains of a common pest into an emblem of elegance, their work resting invisibly on the bridge between craft and illusion. The mouse skin brow's survival into the Revolutionary era was, in large part, due to this industry's resilience and adaptability. Even as political upheaval began to topple the courts that had first embraced it, the craft lingered in urban workshops, ready to adjust its shapes and colors to the tastes of a new social order. The artisans understood what monarchs and ministers often did not. Fashions, like empires, could fall, but the human desire to control and perfect the image in the mirror was far more enduring. In the delicate theater of 18th-century fashion, no trend could rise to prominence without attracting both imitation and ridicule. The mouse skin eyebrow, with its blend of artifice, novelty, and faint absurdity, was destined to be both adored and mocked. It occupied a peculiar place in the cultural imagination, admired for its transformative power, derided for its dependence on what some considered an unseemly source. The very qualities that made it captivating to devotees, the dramatic change it could effect, the precision of its arch, the mystery of its adherents, made it irresistible to satirists, caricaturists, and moralists eager to expose the follies of vanity. In polite society, the faux brow swiftly became a marker of refinement. Ladies at court and in high salons competed subtly in the perfection of their arches, investing in multiple pairs to suit the changing seasons of fashion. A delicate curve with a pronounced lift at the outer edge was favored in Paris under the influence of Madame de Pompadour's circle, believed to convey vivacity and wit. In London, a more horizontal line came into vogue in the 1770s, prized for lending the face a serene, composed expression. For some, the faux brow became part of a larger strategy of visual construction, paired with rouge to enliven the cheeks, patches to draw attention to favorable features, and towering coiffures to elongate the silhouette. Yet while patrons and artisans worked to perfect the illusion, the coffee houses and pamphlet stalls churned with wry commentary. Satire was a central engine of 18th-century public discourse, and fashion trends were among its most frequent targets. The mouse skin brow offered a subject too delicious to ignore. Here was a fad that required the close handling of rodent pelts, adhered to the face, and proclaimed itself the latest refinement. The juxtaposition was comic gold. In Paris, the satirical journal L'Union Jaune published a mock advertisement offering eyebrows of the most distinguished mice of Versailles, complete with fictitious testimonials from court ladies praising their exquisite scurry. In London, the caricaturist James Gilray immortalized the trend in etchings that showed overdressed women peering into mirrors while mice scurried beneath their skirts, suggesting an infestation that began on the dressing table. These images circulated widely, eliciting laughter but also cementing the association of the trend with a kind of excess that teetered on the edge of the ridiculous. Theater, ever alert to the social mood, joined in the lampooning. Comedic plays set in fashionable households often included a scene in which a servant accidentally misplaced or reapplied a mistress's brows unevenly, provoking mock horror. In one popular farce at Drury Lane, a suitor's romantic declaration was undercut when the heroine's brow slid down her cheek during an embrace, prompting an audience roar. Playwrights understood that the mouse skin brow was a perfect comedic device, small enough to be absurd, visible enough to be instantly recognized. Moralists, too, found in the trend a handy emblem for their critiques of vanity and artifice. Religious pamphlets warned that such ornaments distracted from the cultivation of inner virtue, offering as evidence the time and money lavished upon them. A 1769 sermon in Bath thundered against those who shun the brow of truth for the brow of mouse, framing the practice as a departure from sincerity. Philosophical commentators, especially those influenced by Enlightenment debates over authenticity, worried that excessive reliance on such contrivances blurred the line between natural and artificial beauty, eroding trust in appearances. The debate was not entirely one-sided. Defenders of fashion argued that self-presentation was an art form, no less worthy of cultivation than painting or music. Just as an architect might design a facade to harmonize with its surroundings, so might a woman design her face to please the eye and suit the occasion. In this view, the mouse skin brow was not deception but refinement, a way of completing the face in the same manner that a frame completes a painting. One French lady of letters, the Marquise de, her name tactfully omitted in print, published an essay comparing the brow to the architrave of a classical building. Essential to the overall composition, the though rarely noticed until absent. Beneath the satire and the moralizing, the popularity of the faux brow spoke to deeper social currents. In an age of salons, masquerades, and public assemblies, the face was a stage upon which identity could be crafted and recrafted. Cosmetics and accessories allowed individuals, especially women of the elite and aspiring classes, to navigate the fluid boundaries between public and private self. The mouse skin brow, because it could be removed at will, offered a kind of visual flexibility unmatched by more permanent features. One could wear a dramatic, high arch for the opera, then return to a subtler curve for an intimate supper. This adaptability was a virtue in a world where social survival often depended on reading and responding to the shifting currents of taste. Even those who mocked the trend often participated in it. Diaries and correspondence from the period reveal cases of women who privately used faux brows while publicly professing disdain for them. This hypocrisy was itself a source of humor in satirical writing, but it also reflected the practical power of the accessory. Ridicule it though one might, it worked. A well-shaped brow could lend definition to the face, enhance the expressiveness of the eyes, and restore a sense of youthfulness, all without the risks associated with other cosmetic practices, such as the lead-based powders that were slowly poisoning their users. Men, too, entered the conversation, though less frequently as wearers and more as commentators. In certain circles of the theater and the demi-monde, however, actors and performers adopted mouse skin brows to heighten their stage appearance. Male satirists sometimes hinted that such use blurred gender lines in unsettling ways, a charge that added to the moral frisson surrounding the trend. Yet in the realm of performance, artifice was not merely accepted but celebrated, and the brow became another tool in the actor's kit, no different from a wig or a painted backdrop. Internationally, the spread of the trend invited cross-cultural commentary. In Italy, where naturalistic styles and portraiture and personal grooming often prevailed, the mouse skin brow was viewed as a distinctly northern eccentricity. Venetian merchants sold them to curious travelers but rarely adopted them for themselves. In Spain, they appeared sporadically at court, but the darker, fuller natural brows favored there made the artificial versions less appealing. Satirists in Madrid nonetheless found room to lampoon the French and English for their supposed obsession with mouse adornment. By the late 18th century, the tide of satire had begun to turn more sharply. The political upheavals of the French Revolution and the accompanying shifts in taste cast elaborate fashions in a new light. Simplicity and natural beauty became revolutionary virtues, and the elaborate rituals of brow application were increasingly associated with the decadence of the Ancien Regime. Cartoons from the 1790s depicted exiled aristocrats clinging to their mouse skin brows as relics of a lost world, while Republican women prided themselves on bare, unadorned faces. In Britain, the trend persisted a little longer in pockets of high society, but it too eventually waned under the pressure of changing ideals. And yet, even as the mouse skin brow receded from everyday use, it lingered in the popular imagination as a symbol of 18th-century artifice. For later generations looking back on the period, it became one of those charming absurdities that defined the age alongside powdered wigs, towering hairstyles, and elaborate fans. It appeared in costume dramas, historical novels, and museum displays, often exaggerated for comic or picturesque effect. Satire had ensured its survival in memory long after fashion had moved on. This interplay between fashion and ridicule was, in truth, essential to the life cycle of the trend. Without the satirical spotlight, the mouse skin brow might have remained a quiet, even obscure accessory, known only to a few. Instead, mockery propelled it into broader awareness, inviting people across classes to share in the joke even as some continued to wear it. The laughter it inspired may have been at its expense, but it also granted it a kind of immortality. By the close of the century, those who still crafted and sold faux brows were fewer, but their work was still recognized among connoisseurs of historical fashion. Collectors began to preserve examples as curiosities, while chroniclers of the age noted them alongside other vanities. In this afterlife, the mouse skin brow belonged to the world of satire as much as to the world of fashion, its image fixed between admiration and amusement. For all their charm and fashion appeal, mouse skin eyebrows carried with them a quiet undercurrent of risks that were not immediately obvious to the women who wore them, nor even to the artisans who crafted them. In the 18th century, before the germ theory of disease and modern understandings of hygiene, beauty practices often existed in a delicate balance between allure and hazard. The mouse skin brow, though diminutive in size, was no exception. It was a product of its time, crafted from organic materials, handled in environments far removed from the sterile conditions of a laboratory, and applied directly to the sensitive skin of the face. The material itself, real skin from rodents, was the first source of concern. While the term mouse could encompass a range of small rodents, including voles and dormice, most artisans preferred actual mice for their soft, fine fur and the pliability of their skin once treated. The preparation process involved skinning the animal, scraping away flesh and fat, and stretching the hide flat to dry. Once dried, it was softened with oils or waxes and cut into the desired brow shapes. For the more fastidious customers, the skins were dyed or darkened with soot or plant-based pigments to achieve the fashionable shades of the day. Yet in an era without antiseptics, this preparation could leave behind traces of organic matter. In the warm, enclosed spaces of 18th century dressing rooms, such materials could become breeding grounds for mites or other pests, especially if the brows were stored improperly. Wealthy ladies kept theirs in decorative boxes on vanities, sometimes lined with scented cloth to mask any lingering odor. But scent could only disguise, not prevent, the potential for decay. A careless or overused pair might begin to shed fur, leaving a telltale trace on the wearer's cheeks. Application was another arena where risk lurked. The brows were typically affixed with a form of spirit gum, a resinous adhesive derived from natural tree saps, or with glues made from fish skin or boiled animal hooves. These adhesives were effective but could irritate sensitive skin, particularly when applied near the eyes. Repeated use could lead to redness, itching, or small sores along the brow bone. In a few documented cases from London's beauty circles, women developed persistent infections at the application site, which in turn caused actual eyebrow hair to fall out, making them even more dependent on their faux replacements. Doctors of the time, operating with the limited medical knowledge available, began to take note. In 1768, the physician John Arbuthnot included a brief mention of artificial brows of mouse in a treatise on skin afflictions, warning that the use of animal adhesives and untreated pelts might induce certain cutaneous eruptions. In Paris, the royal court physician François Chiconeau privately advised some of his patients to replace mouse skins with silk or fine wool, though such substitutions were rarely as convincing to the discerning eye. But perhaps the greater danger was not the material itself, but the broader context of 18th century hygiene. Bathing was not yet the daily habit it would later become. While the wealthy might cleanse their faces regularly, full immersion in water was viewed by many with suspicion, especially during the colder months. Cosmetic routines often involved layering powders, rouges, and other preparations over the skin without removing all traces of the previous day's application. In such an environment, a glued-on piece of rodent skin could trap dirt and oils, creating a microclimate where bacteria flourished. The problem was compounded by the culture of sharing beauty items. Among close friends or within households, it was not unusual for women to lend each other accessories, including faux brows, for a special occasion. What seemed like a gesture of camaraderie could also be a vector for transmitting skin conditions. Physicians of the time lacked the vocabulary to describe microbial contagion, but they observed patterns. One lady's rash might appear on another's brow within a week of borrowing her mouse skins. The phenomenon was sometimes chalked up to sympathy or the influence of humors, but the practical outcome was the same, spreading irritation from one wearer to another. There was also the matter of pest attraction. In households where food was stored or served near dressing rooms, a common arrangement in larger homes, rodent-derived items could, ironically, attract other rodents. Servants reported finding gnaw marks on unattended boxes of faux brows, suggesting that mice were cannibalizing their own kind for the oils and residual scent. This unseemly detail rarely reached polite conversation, but it appeared in satirical tracts and private letters as a darkly comic anecdote. Still, for all these hidden dangers, many women considered the risks worth taking. Beauty, in the 18th century calculus, was not merely a matter of personal satisfaction, but a currency in the marketplace of marriage, social advancement, and influence. A well-maintained appearance could open doors that might otherwise remain closed. For an aging widow seeking a second marriage, or a young debutante eager to catch the eye of a wealthy suitor, the promise of a fuller, more expressive brow was not to be dismissed lightly. It is telling that even when whispers of health hazards began to circulate, they did little to dampen the trend among the upper classes. In part, this was because such risks were seen as the price of refinement. Fashionable women were already enduring lead-based face powders, mercury-containing skin lighteners, and dangerously tight corsets. A strip of mouse skin on the brow seemed, by comparison, almost benign. In some cases, health warnings were even inverted into markers of status. If only the wealthy could afford such luxuries, then enduring their minor perils became a subtle display of privilege. The story was different, however, in the burgeoning middle class, where thrift and practicality tempered indulgence. Here, reports of rashes or pest problems could quickly curtail the appeal of an accessory. This created a small but steady demand for alternatives, such as brows made from human hair collected from wigmakers' offcuts, or embroidered brows on fine silk mesh. These substitutes lacked the soft texture of mouse skin but carried fewer hygiene concerns, and they found a niche among those wary of the rodent association. By the final decades of the century, the health discourse around cosmetics was beginning to change. Enlightenment-era interest in science and medicine was fostering new attention to cleanliness, and writers in both France and England began to advocate for natural beauty as a healthier, more honest ideal. In medical pamphlets, the mouse skin brow was increasingly held up as an example of the dangers of artificial ornamentation, not only for its potential to harbor pests or cause skin ailments, but as a symbol of the broader deception that cosmetics represented. And yet, as with so many fashions, the transition away from mouse skin brows was gradual, not abrupt. They continued to appear at masked balls and private gatherings long after they had vanished from daily wear. And in these more theatrical settings, the health risks seemed irrelevant. When worn for an evening rather than a season, they were unlikely to cause lasting harm, and their dramatic effect was still unmatched by newer materials. From a modern perspective, it is easy to view the mouse skin brow as a quaint curiosity, a relic of a less hygienic age. But in their own time, they were part of a continuum of beauty practices that always balanced allure against hazard. The women who wore them were not ignorant of the trade-offs. They simply made their choices in a context where appearance could be a form of power, and power was worth a little risk. In this, they were not so different from today's consumers of beauty treatments that carry their own subtle dangers. By the turn of the 19th century, the mouse skin brow had largely receded into the past, its health hazards overtaken by changing tastes and materials. But its story remains a revealing chapter in the history of cosmetics, a reminder that beauty has always been an intimate negotiation between the body, the materials at hand, and the cultural imagination, with health concerns rarely strong enough to stop the march of fashion. Behind every fashion trend, no matter how frivolous or eccentric it might seem in hindsight, there is an economy, a network of suppliers, artisans, traders, and retailers who transform an idea into a product and a product into profit. The 18th century mouse skin eyebrow craze was no different. Beneath its delicate strips of fur lay a surprisingly complex system of trade that linked the drawing rooms of Paris and London to the humble kitchens, workshops, and street markets where the raw materials were procured. It is tempting to imagine that such a small, niche beauty item would have been produced casually, in the manner of an occasional indulgence. Yet the records, receipts, merchant logs, and advertisements suggest otherwise. The mouse skin brow, once it gained popularity in elite circles, quickly became a commodity with its own specialized supply chain. This chain began, unsurprisingly, with the mice themselves. Mice were ubiquitous in 18th century Europe, thriving in granaries, stables, and city alleys. For the common laborer, they were pests to be trapped or poisoned. For the entrepreneurial few, they were a resource to be harvested. The demand for their skins created a small but steady trade for those who could catch them in quantity. In rural areas, Children often took part in trapping, selling their catches to itinerant traders who moved between towns. In cities, where vermin control was a necessity, rat catchers added mouse pelts to their list of marketable goods, supplementing their income beyond the bounty paid by households and municipalities. Once obtained, the skins required preparation, a skill that was neither entirely butcher's work nor entirely milliner's craft, but something between the two. Some pelts were processed by the catchers themselves, especially in rural districts where other trades were scarce. In urban centers, however, this work was often handed over to specialists. Small workshops, sometimes affiliated with wig makers or glove makers, where animal hides were already part of the daily trade. The preparation process was delicate. Unlike the thicker hides used for leather goods, mouse skin was thin and prone to tearing. Workers scraped and stretched them with tiny knives and bone tools, then dried them on small wooden frames. Any remaining scent of the animal was a liability in the final product, so the skins were treated with scented oils, lavender, rose, or bergamot being the most fashionable. These scents not only masked unpleasant odors, but added an aura of refinement to the finished brows. By the mid-1700s, an organized commercial pathway was in place. Mouse skins traveled from provincial trappers to processing workshops, then to the artisans who cut and styled them into brows. These artisans were often women, widows or unmarried daughters, who worked from home or in small rooms adjoining wig shops. The work required a steady hand, a good eye for symmetry, and an understanding of fashionable shapes. Straight, arched, or gently curved, each style had its moment in the limelight, and customers often ordered several pairs to suit different occasions. Retail distribution took two main forms. The first was through milliners and perruquiers, wig makers, who displayed mouse skin brows alongside beauty patches, false hairpieces, and other accessories. These shops catered to a clientele that was already accustomed to buying high-end grooming products and who valued the convenience of acquiring all their beauty needs under one roof. The second form was itinerant sales, with peddlers carrying small cases of brows to sell at fairs, markets, and door-to-door in wealthier neighborhoods. While the itinerant route could not match the prestige of a city shop, it allowed for broader geographic reach, bringing the fashion to provincial towns and even across borders. Prices varied depending on quality, style, and location. In Paris during the 1760s, a well-made pair of mouse skin brows could cost the equivalent of a skilled laborer's daily wage. In London, prices were slightly lower, reflecting a more competitive market but also a broader middle-class clientele willing to spend on such novelties. Cheaper versions, sometimes made from coarser fur or less carefully treated skins, were available for those unwilling or unable to pay premium rates, though these were more likely to cause skin irritation or fall apart quickly. The trade also revealed a surprising international dimension. French and English merchants, often in competition in other industries, found common cause in the exchange of luxury goods. French-made brows, prized for their delicate craftsmanship, were imported into England for the uppermost tier of society, while English-made versions, known for durability, were exported to the continent. Smuggling was not unheard of, especially during times of political tension, when tariffs or import restrictions made luxury goods more expensive. Further afield, the fashion trickled into other European capitals. In Vienna and St. Petersburg, aristocratic women acquired mouse skin brows through French or English intermediaries. In Italy, the fashion merged with local traditions of theatrical costuming, finding a natural place in the elaborate makeup worn during Carnival. The movement of these goods across borders speaks to the interconnectedness of 18th-century Europe's luxury economy, where ideas and materials traveled faster than one might expect in a pre-industrial age. Behind the glamour of this trade, however, lay stark contrasts in labor and profit. At the bottom of the chain, trappers and processors earned only a fraction of the final retail price. Their work was physically unpleasant, handling dead animals, scraping skins, dealing with the occasional infestation, and carried social stigma. Artisans who crafted the brows fared better, especially if they built a reputation for quality, but they too were often dependent on the merchants who controlled access to wealthy clients. It was the retailers, especially those with fashionable addresses, who reaped the lion's share of profits. The economics of the trade also reveal how beauty trends can create unexpected markets for otherwise low-value resources. In most contexts, a mouse pelt was worthless. At best, it might be discarded without thought. Yet in the world of high fashion, it became a sought-after raw material, its scarcity and quality form driving up prices. This transformation from pest to luxury component mirrors similar patterns in the history of fashion, from beaver pelts for hats to feathers for millinery. The market's reliance on animal products also tied it to broader debates about consumption and morality. Some moralists condemned the use of mouse skin brows as wasteful, frivolous, or even cruel, while others defended it as a practical reuse of what would otherwise be discarded. In this sense, the trade became entangled in the larger Enlightenment-era discourse on the ethics of luxury, a discourse that wrestled with questions about the moral impact of indulgence on both individuals and society. By the 1780s, the mouse skin brow trade had reached its zenith. Shops in Paris advertised them with florid descriptions. The finest hairs, in the most natural arch, for the perfection of the eye, and even provincial newspapers carried notices for their sale. At the same time, competition was driving innovation. Some artisans began experimenting with human hair, silk, or fine wool to produce brows that could rival the softness of mouse fur, while appealing to customers concerned about hygiene or cruelty. These alternatives would eventually overtake mouse skin in popularity, aided by shifts in fashion toward a more natural look in the early 19th century. Yet for a few decades, the mouse skin brow market demonstrated the peculiar alchemy of fashion economics. It took something as ordinary, and to many, repulsive, as a rodent's hide and transformed it into a high-value commodity, linking trappers in rural barns to noble women in gilded salons. The trade was not merely a sideline of the beauty industry. It was a miniature economy in its own right, shaped by the same forces of supply, demand, and status that have driven luxury markets for centuries. In tracing this commerce, we see more than just an oddity of fashion history. We see the intricate machinery by which trends are sustained, the labor that goes unseen, the profit that flows upward, and the way in which beauty, fleeting though it may be, can reshape entire networks of production and trade. Like the delicate brows themselves, the market was both fragile and finely tuned, surviving only as long as the style held sway. When that style faded, the market dissolved almost overnight, leaving behind little more than a scattering of records and the faint memory of a time when a mouse's fur could be worth its weight in silver. If the economics of the mouse skin eyebrow trade revealed the hidden machinery of 18th century fashion, the way society reacted to it revealed something far more volatile: the human tendency to mock, moralize, and mythologize anything that strays too far from the familiar. The mouse skin brow may have been a small strip of fur, but it carried on its tiny arch a disproportionate weight of public opinion. In the salons and coffee houses of Europe, it was not merely a cosmetic accessory. It was a symbol, ripe for praise or ridicule, depending on who was speaking. Among the upper classes, particularly in Paris and London, the reception was initially one of admiration and curiosity. Early adopters, often women of high birth or courtesans with an instinct for the next sensation, were lauded for their daring embrace of the new fashion. In an era when appearance was currency, any device that promised a more symmetrical face or a more expressive brow was worth the investment. Some gushed that mouse skin brows, when cut and affixed with care, restored the language of the eyes to women whose own brows had thinned from age, illness, or overzealous plucking. This was a society that valued the power of the gaze. To enhance it was to wield a subtle weapon in the dance of attraction and influence. But admiration is a fickle thing, and novelty often invites suspicion. As the trend spread, a parallel current of mockery began to surface. Satirical prints, an 18th century precursor to today's viral memes, depicted fashionable ladies in exaggerated form, their brows like enormous caterpillars threatening to crawl off their foreheads. London's print shops, ever attuned to public appetite for scandal, sold caricatures showing noble women losing their brows mid-conversation or having them stolen by enterprising mice. These engravings were more than simple humor. They were social commentary, targeting not only the fashion itself but the vanity and extravagance it represented. Moralists, too, had their say. Preachers and pamphleteers used the mouse skin brow as an emblem of the artificiality and decadence of the age. In their sermons and essays, they painted a picture of a society obsessed with surface, willing to paste the remains of vermin to their faces in pursuit of beauty. To them, this was proof of a moral decline, a departure from natural grace toward grotesque artifice. In a period when the Enlightenment was promoting ideals of reason and authenticity, the mouse skin brow was an easy target for those who believed fashion corrupted virtue. Nor was criticism confined to men. Many women outside the circles of high fashion regarded the brows with skepticism, if not outright disdain. Rural women, whose lives were dominated by practical concerns, saw the trend as a frivolity of the idle rich. Middle-class urban women, while often more fashion-conscious, were sometimes reluctant to adopt a style that seemed to invite ridicule from satirists and scorn from moralists. In this way, the mouse skin brow became a kind of cultural fault line, dividing those who embraced it as a mark of sophistication from those who rejected it as a sign of vanity. Yet even those who mocked could not entirely ignore its allure. In private, some critics of the fashion admitted to trying the brows for a masquerade ball or a theatrical performance, where the rules of appearance were more flexible. Actors and actresses adopted them for certain roles, particularly in comedies of manners where exaggerated features could enhance the performance. In these contexts, the brows became both costume and commentary, a way to inhabit the persona of a fashionable wit or a pretentious social climber. The theater, in fact, played a significant role in shaping public perception. Playwrights of the period, never shy about lampooning trends, wove references to mouse skin brows into their scripts. In some farces, a misplaced or drooping brow was the punchline of an entire scene. In others, the sudden revelation that a character's brows were false served as a metaphor for the revelation of their hypocrisy. Audiences laughed, but they also internalized the association between the brows and a certain type of person, vain, superficial, perhaps a little ridiculous. In the salons, where intellectuals and socialites mingled over tea and debate, the brows were sometimes defended as an art form. A skilled artisan, it was argued, could craft a pair so natural and expressive that they became a work of miniature sculpture, worthy of the same respect accorded to a fine wig or a well-tailored gown. Some philosophers, intrigued by the interplay between nature and artifice, used the mouse skin brow as a case study in their discussions of aesthetics. Was beauty a matter of conforming to nature, or of improving upon it through art? Could something artificial still be considered beautiful if it achieved the desired effect? In these circles, the brow was less a frivolity and more a philosophical provocation. The broader public, however, was often less charitable. Street ballads mocked the fashion in rhyming couplets, and gossip columns printed stories, real or invented, of mishaps involving mouse skin brows. One widely circulated tale told of a duchess whose brows slid down her cheeks during a particularly warm evening at Versailles, prompting the king himself to quip that her eyes had descended in rank. Whether true or not, such stories were repeated with relish, feeding the perception that the brows were both fragile and faintly absurd. Class played a decisive role in shaping these perceptions. For the aristocracy, adopting the mouse skin brow was a way to signal alignment with the cutting edge of fashion. For the emerging middle class, it was a way to imitate the aristocracy, though often at risk of being accused of pretension. For the poor, the brows were an unattainable luxury, but one they could mock without consequence. In this way, the trend became part of the larger social theater of the 18th century, where every garment, gesture, and adornment carried layers of meaning about wealth, status, and aspiration. There was also a gendered dimension to the satire. Men who adopted mouse skin brows, whether to enhance their appearance or to conform to the elaborate grooming standards of the day, were often targets of even sharper ridicule. In an age when masculinity was still closely tied to ideals of stoicism and natural strength, the idea of a man pasting bits of fur to his forehead was ripe for mockery. Some satirists seized on this to question the moral fiber of dandies and fops, suggesting that such men were unfit for serious matters like politics or war. Still, for all the scorn, the mouse skin brow persisted in fashion for decades. In part, this endurance was due to the resilience of its core clientele, women and men at the very top of society, whose tastes set the tone for those below. But it also owed something to the peculiar fact that ridicule, in the realm of fashion, can sometimes reinforce rather than diminish a trend. To be mocked was, in a strange way, to be acknowledged. To be the subject of satire was to be part of the conversation. In this sense, the mouse skin brow lived in a paradox. It was at once a laughingstock and a badge of relevance. As the 18th century drew toward its close, the political and cultural upheavals of the age began to shift the terms of this conversation. The French Revolution, with its emphasis on republican virtue and disdain for aristocratic excess, cast a harsh light on the mouse skin brow as a relic of the old regime. In England, too, the rise of neoclassical ideals favored a simpler, more natural aesthetic, making heavily artificial adornments seem dated. Satire that had once been lighthearted took on a sharper edge, aligning the brows with the perceived decadence of a fading order. Yet even as the fashion waned, the legacy of its social perception endured. The mouse skin brow had been more than a beauty accessory. It had been a cultural symbol, a litmus test for taste, class, and moral judgment. Its rise and fall charted the shifting tides of public opinion in an age when appearance was inseparable from identity, and when even the smallest ornament could carry the weight of a political statement. By the time the brows disappeared from the faces of Europe's elite, their image had been fixed in the public imagination, forever a shorthand for the vanities and absurdities of 18th century fashion. They lived on in the caricatures and plays, in the moral tracts and philosophical debates, as a reminder that beauty, in all its forms, is never just about appearance. It is about perception, how others see us, how we wish to be seen, and how the gap between the two is navigated in the endless theater of society. In the candlelit dressing rooms of 18th century Europe, beauty was an elaborate ritual. The wigs were powdered, the gowns were stitched with gleaming threads, and the mouse skin brows were carefully lifted from their velvet-lined boxes. To an observer, the process seemed almost surgical in its precision, delicate tweezers lifting each brow, dabbing it with a thin smear of adhesive, and pressing it in a place above the eye. But beneath the elegance of the gesture lurked a reality rarely acknowledged in polite society, the fact that these brows were, quite literally, strips of animal skin. And with that fact came an entire catalog of hygienic and medical concerns that few wished to discuss openly. The primary issue was freshness, or, more accurately, the lack of it. Mouse skin, once removed from the animal, began an inevitable process of decay. Though artisans treated the skins with alum, salts, and other rudimentary preservatives to slow deterioration, the methods were crude by modern standards. In damp weather, the tiny strips could retain moisture, developing an unpleasant odor detectable only at close range, but mortifying if noticed in a crowded salon. Warm, humid environments, such as summer gatherings or candlelit balls, accelerated the problem, leading to what one contemporary physician euphemistically described as a certain mephitic emanation. Skin contact compounded the hazard. The adhesive used to affix the brows, often a mixture of tree gum, fish glue, or even a concoction of egg white and sugar, created a warm, slightly sticky interface between human skin and the preserved pelt. This was an ideal environment for bacterial growth, especially in a period when the existence of microbes was not yet understood. Wearers occasionally developed itching, redness, or rashes along the brow line, conditions that physicians diagnosed with vague terms like cutaneous inflammation or pustular eruptions. In severe cases, the irritation spread to the eyelids, causing swelling that could linger for weeks. Beyond these surface ailments, there were darker fears. Europe in the 18th century was still haunted by the memory of plague, and while mice themselves were not always directly blamed, fleas and contagion were still imperfectly understood. They carried an unmistakable association with filth and disease. Moralists eager to condemn the mouse skin brow leaned heavily on this point, warning that a woman who pasted vermin to her face risked more than her reputation. She might be courting a slow and terrible illness. Some pamphlets, blending medical advice with moral panic, claimed that the effluvia of such skins long kept and oft applied, may well convey a miasma most injurious to health. It is worth noting that such warnings were often exaggerated for rhetorical effect. There are no reliable records of plague or lethal illness directly resulting from mouse skin brows. Nonetheless, the lack of proper sanitation made the risk of secondary infections, styes, conjunctivitis, or festering sores quite real. In some cases, these infections left scars, ironically disfiguring the very face the brows were meant to beautify. The challenge of cleaning the brows without destroying them was another persistent problem. Mouse skin was delicate, and repeated wetting caused the hairs to loosen or the skin to warp. Some artisans advised clients to air their brows after each use by pinning them to a small board in a sunny window, allowing light and warmth to discourage dampness. Others recommended dusting the underside with a fine powder of crushed orris root, both to absorb moisture and to mask unpleasant odors. Wealthy clients sometimes owned several pairs, rotating them to allow each set a period of rest and drying between uses. There was also the issue of pests, not the original mouse, but opportunistic insects. Moth larvae, which were notorious for infesting wigs and fur trims, could find their way into the soft fibers of the brow if it was stored carelessly. One satirical newspaper recounts an incident in which a lady, mid-conversation at a London assembly, discovered a tiny moth emerging from her right brow. Whether this story was true or merely a piece of comic invention, it touched on a genuine anxiety that one's carefully curated image could be undone by nature's smallest saboteurs. Physicians of the era, though lacking the germ theory of disease, often recognized that prolonged contact with poorly cured animal products was unwise. Some began to recommend alternative materials. Human hair stitched onto fine silk strips, or painted patches meant to simulate the arch of a brow without the bulk of fur. These substitutes, however, rarely achieved the same three-dimensional effect, and many fashionable women preferred to risk the health concerns rather than sacrifice the illusion of fullness. In this way, the choice to wear mouse skin brows became an early example of what would later be termed the beauty versus safety dilemma, a tension that continues in cosmetics and fashion to this day. Interestingly, certain apothecaries saw the health concerns as a business opportunity. They marketed sanitized brows, claiming that their mouse skins were cured with special herbal infusions to ward off illness. These treatments often included rosemary, lavender, and wormwood, plants with natural aromatic properties that could mask odors and perhaps deter some insects. Whether these concoctions had any genuine antiseptic effect is doubtful, but they offered reassurance to anxious clients. The scented brows also became a novelty in themselves, with some ladies requesting custom blends so that their brows carried the faintest trace of their signature perfume. The link between the brows and disease fears also provided fertile ground for satirists. Caricatures began to depict fashionable women applying their brows while swarms of mice and rats scampered across their dressing tables, as though the animals themselves were lining up to offer their skins. Others showed gentlemen recoiling in horror as a lady leaned close, a visible greenish haze wafting from her face. These images exaggerated reality but captured an underlying unease that beauty, in its most artificial forms, might conceal an invisible rot. The theatrical world, always quick to amplify the grotesque, made ample use of these associations. In comedies and pantomimes, a mouse skin brow might peel away to reveal a rash beneath, or fall into a glass of wine, prompting exaggerated cries of disgust from the other characters. Audiences laughed, but such portrayals reinforced the connection between the fashion and the idea of contamination, whether of the body, the morals, or the social order itself. Still, there were those who embraced the danger, framing it as a mark of devotion to beauty. Some commentators compared the wearing of mouse skin brows to the wearing of corsets, which could deform the ribs and restrict breathing, or to the use of white lead face paint, which could slowly poison the skin. In each case, the wearer knowingly accepted a degree of risk for the sake of maintaining an idealized appearance. To these defenders, criticism of the brow was simply another manifestation of society's eternal discomfort with women exercising agency over their own image, even at a personal cost. Yet by the late 18th century, as Enlightenment thought began to influence not only politics and philosophy, but also personal habits, the balance started to shift. The emphasis on natural beauty, bolstered by neoclassical art and the writings of thinkers like Rousseau, made the idea of pasting animal skin to one's forehead seem increasingly incompatible with ideals of health and authenticity. Medical advice, though still imperfect, began to place more weight on hygiene and the avoidance of corrupt airs and putrefying substances in close contact with the skin. Public health measures, such as campaigns to control urban vermin populations, added another layer of disapproval, making the mouse skin brow a symbol not just of vanity, but of willful uncleanliness. By the time the trend finally waned, it carried with it the residue of these health debates. The fashion's decline was due not only to changing tastes, but also to a growing awareness, however incomplete, of the connection between personal adornment and physical well-being. The mouse skin brow thus occupies an unusual place in the history of beauty, an accessory that was at once a luxury item, a social statement, and a public health cautionary tale. Its story reminds us that every cosmetic trend, no matter how small or strange, exists in a web of practical realities. How it is made, how it is worn, and what invisible risks it carries. And in the flickering candlelight of 18th century Europe, the women and men who donned those tiny arches of fur were making a choice far more complicated than it appeared in the mirror. To embrace beauty in defiance of decay, to court admiration despite the whispers of disease, and to stake their place in a society where appearance was both armor and vulnerability. If the salons and drawing rooms of 18th century Europe were the stage upon which mouse skin brows dazzled their admirers, the workshops of the artisans were the unseen backstage, places where fur, flesh, glue, and imagination came together to create a tiny, improbable marvel. These spaces were not the grand ateliers of portrait painters or the airy shops of wigmakers whose work could be displayed in windows. They were smaller, more secretive, and often located in the narrow lanes behind fashionable districts, tucked between glove makers, perfumers, and sellers of ribbons. The craft of making faux eyebrows from mouse skin was not widely advertised. It was whispered between trusted acquaintances, passed along in recommendations from ladies' maids to their mistresses, and conducted under the discretion expected of trades that dealt with the more intimate aspects of personal beauty. The process began with the raw material, the humble house mouse. Despite its lowly reputation, the mouse offered exactly what the fashion required: fine, soft hairs that could mimic the natural brow without appearing coarse or bristly. The color range, from pale gray to deep brown, allowed artisans to match the shade to the wearer's hair or to the idealized tones dictated by the current vogue. Procuring these animals was itself a specialized trade. In large cities, mouse catchers operated much like rat catchers, setting traps in kitchens, granaries, and stables, then selling their captures to furriers who understood the particular demands of the brow makers. In rural areas, some small-scale brow makers kept their own traps, ensuring a steady supply. Once the mouse was obtained, the work became a matter of precision and delicacy. The pelt was carefully removed in strips, the artisan taking care to keep the hair aligned in its natural direction. These strips were then washed, sometimes in a mild solution of alum, other times in vinegar diluted with water, to remove oils and odors. This stage was crucial, for any lingering scent could betray the origin of the material or, worse, repel the wearer's companions. After cleaning, the skins were laid flat to dry on small wooden frames, their edges pinned taut to prevent curling. The next step was curing. Artisans used a variety of powders and pastes for this, some of which were closely guarded secrets. Orris root powder was common, lending both a subtle fragrance and a preservative quality. Finely ground pumice or chalk dust could be added to help absorb remaining moisture. In some workshops, the curing process also involved pressing the skins under a warm, weighted board, flattening them into a uniform thinness while ensuring the hair remained supple and upright. Once cured, the strips were trimmed into the desired shape. This was where artistry truly entered the process. A skilled brow maker could cut an arch so natural that it seemed to have grown directly from the wearer's face. The fashionable shapes of the time varied. Some favored a long, gently sloping brow that extended beyond the natural line. Others preferred a shorter, higher arch that gave the eyes a look of perpetual curiosity. Certain artisans became known for their signature styles, attracting clients from far beyond their own city. Just as a wigmaker might advertise his ability to mimic the curls of a French duchess, a browmaker could claim to reproduce the precise angle worn by a celebrated beauty of the court. Attaching the finished brows to the wearer's skin required yet another skill, and some artisans offered this as part of their service. Using adhesives derived from gum arabic, fish glue, or a sticky paste made from tragacanth, they would fit the brow precisely, ensuring it adhered smoothly without visible gaps. The angle was everything. A brow placed too high could make the wearer appear perpetually surprised, while one too low risked a brooding or sullen expression. Wealthy clients often entrusted the application to the artisan or to a trusted maid who had been trained in the technique. Not all browmakers were equal in their reputation. In major cities like Paris, London, and Vienna, there were tiers within the trade. At the top were those who catered exclusively to the nobility, their workrooms outfitted with fine tools, ivory-handled knives, silver tweezers, and magnifying lenses imported from Venice. Their brows were boxed in cases lined with silk, accompanied by written instructions for care. Further down the ladder were the more utilitarian makers, who produced brows in batches and sold them in small packets to apothecaries and perfumers for resale. These brows, while cheaper, were often less artfully shaped and more prone to deterioration. The craft also attracted a certain degree of moral scrutiny. The very act of skinning mice was distasteful to some, and there were whispers about artisans who sourced their materials from less than reputable suppliers, including those who scavenged dead mice from traps not meant for beauty purposes. Such shortcuts risked both quality and hygiene, but in a trade that operated largely on trust, they were difficult to detect until the brows began to show flaws, or worse, to emit a faint, telltale odor. For the artisans themselves, the work was a blend of pride and pragmatism. Many saw it as part of the broader tradition of beautification crafts that included wig-making, patch cutting, and the preparation of cosmetics. They were serving a clientele that demanded innovation, and they understood that fashion was fickle. Today's essential accessory could be tomorrow's forgotten folly. A skilled browmaker often kept an eye on emerging trends, ready to shift from mouse skin to other materials, such as human hair or silk thread, should demand wane. In some cases, browmakers collaborated with other trades. Perfumers might supply the scented powders used in curing, while jewelers crafted tiny cases to hold and protect the delicate pieces. A few even worked with portrait painters, whose careful depictions of society ladies wearing the latest brow styles served as indirect advertisements for the artisan's skill. This network of interconnected trades highlights how the mouse skin brow, for all its apparent absurdity, was embedded in a thriving economic ecosystem. One fascinating aspect of the craft was the custom work commissioned for the theater. Stage actors, particularly in comedies and court masks, relied on exaggerated brows to convey character. For these, browmakers might use darker or more sharply angled mouse skins, or even layer two strips for a fuller effect that would be visible under candlelight. Theatrical brows were often made for durability rather than subtlety, reinforced with stronger adhesives to withstand the heat and movement of performance. It is tempting to imagine the artisan at work, seated at a narrow bench under a high window, tools arranged in neat rows, the faint scent of alum and orris root in the air. Outside, the clatter of carriage wheels echoed down the cobbled street, but inside, the world was reduced to the fine precision of hair, skin, and blade. Each cut, each brush of powder, was a step toward transforming the refuse of a household pest into an object of desire. The skill required to make a truly convincing brow cannot be overstated. In a century without industrial magnification or precision cutting machines, the artisan relied entirely on the eye, the hand, and the feel of the material. Even the slightest tremor could ruin a strip, wasting hours of work. That sense of touch, the ability to gauge thickness, flexibility, and alignment by the fingertips, was a hallmark of mastery in the trade. Apprentices might spend months merely preparing raw skins before being allowed to attempt shaping, and years before they could be trusted to complete a brow from start to finish. In the upper echelons of society, possessing a set of brows from a renowned artisan became a subtle form of status display. Just as a lady might boast of wearing a gown from a particular dressmaker, she might let slip that her brows were the work of Monsieur Fournier in Paris or Mrs. Halloway in London. These names traveled in elite circles, their reputations bolstered by the beauty and social standing of their clients. Some artisans even stamped their initials discreetly onto the inside of the brow storage case, a quiet signature for those in the know. But perhaps the most intriguing thing about the artisans who made mouse skin brows was the duality of their craft. On one hand, they dealt in the ephemeral, the fleeting fashions of a season, the delicate skins that would eventually wear out. On the other, they participated in an enduring human endeavor, the reshaping of the self through artifice. Their work, though small in scale, was part of a centuries-old continuum that stretched from ancient Egyptian kohl to the synthetic lashes of the modern era. In the end, the craftsmanship behind the mouse skin brow was not merely a curiosity of fashion history. It was a testament to human ingenuity, to the ability to take something ordinary, perhaps even repellent, and transform it into a thing of beauty. Whether one regards the trend with admiration, amusement, or distaste, the skill of the artisans remains undeniable. They were, in their own way, the sculptors of the face, shaping not marble or clay, but the very frame through which the world perceives the human gaze. If fashion is a language, then the faces of the elite are its most persuasive rhetoric, and in the late 18th century, no accessory spoke more slyly of sophistication than a well-crafted pair of mouse skin eyebrows. The trend did not merely drift through society unnoticed. It blazed its way into public consciousness because it was worn and perfected by women and men whose beauty, influence, and audacity made them living billboards for whatever fad they embraced. It was in their salons, at their theater boxes, in their portraits, and on their very expressions that mouse skin brows gained their legitimacy and allure. Foremost among these was the radiant Marie Antoinette, whose image, whether preserved in oils by Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun or echoed in countless engravings, was a beacon for European fashion. Though much about her toilette has been mythologized, it is certain that she valued symmetry and definition in her face, and the mouse skin brow offered both. Her own brows, naturally pale and fine, could vanish under the heavy powders and lead-based paints of the period. The delicate fur strips, tinted to match the powdered wigs she favored, restored that essential frame to her gaze, lending it both softness and authority. Courtiers noted how her brows seemed to float effortlessly, unshadowed by the imperfections of nature. As with so many of her choices, what she wore soon became the desire of every aspirant to courtly elegance. In London, another name reigned supreme in matters of beauty, Georgiana Cavendish, Duchess of Devonshire. A political hostess and celebrated wit, Georgiana's face was her calling card, and she understood the impact of a striking profile. Her brows were not mere imitations of nature. They were deliberate strokes of artistry, often shaped into a sharper arch than was common in France, lending her a look of amused intelligence. Gossip sheets of the era described her brows as the very signature of fashion, and caricaturists, even when mocking her, could not resist rendering them with exaggerated flourish. For Georgiana, the mouse skin brow was not a disguise but a proclamation, a declaration that beauty was to be constructed and curated, as much a part of public life as political alliances. Beyond the palaces and drawing rooms, the theater became another stage for the trend to shine. Sarah Siddons, the great tragic actress of the English stage, used her brows as part of her theatrical arsenal. In candlelit auditoriums, subtlety was lost. Her mouse skin brows were crafted with darker fur and bolder arches to project expression all the way to the cheap seats. When she played Lady Macbeth, the angular lift of her brows conveyed ambition and menace. As Desdemona, the softer curve suggested innocence and vulnerability. Audiences, enthralled by her performances, often left with the impression that her face itself was art, a notion reinforced when fashionable women began requesting Siddons brows from their beauty suppliers. In Parisian artistic circles, the painter Elizabeth V.G. Lebrun herself was rumored to occasionally don mouse skin brows when sitting for her own portraits or attending court. Though she painted with remarkable honesty, she also understood that art and appearance often required a little enhancement to meet the ideal. For a woman who moved between the worlds of artistry and high society, the brow served as both personal adornment and professional inspiration, proof that the boundaries between life and artifice were more porous than most admitted. Men, too, found uses for the fashion, though their adoption was often subtler. Philippe d'Orléans, cousin to King Louis XVI and a figure of both political intrigue and libertine excess, was known for maintaining an immaculately groomed face despite the heavy drinking and late nights that characterized his lifestyle. Mouse skin brows, shaped to mimic a youthful arch, softened the signs of age and indulgence. Among diplomats and courtiers, such grooming was quietly noted and sometimes emulated, for a man's brows could frame not just his eyes but the impression he left in negotiation or flirtation. Even the world of music was not immune. In Vienna, Countess Therese von Brunswick, a noted patron and friend of Beethoven, reportedly wore brows that enhanced the intensity of her already formidable gaze. In correspondence, one admirer described her eyes as lit from above by a shadow of perfection, almost certainly a poetic nod to the precise line of her artificial brows. For women like her, moving in salons where intellectual discussion was as valued as appearance, the brow became a tool of persuasion, a small but potent signal of presence and intent. Painters and portraitists played a crucial role in popularizing these icons and their brows. When V.G. Lebrun painted Marie Antoinette, she immortalized not just the queen but the delicate framing of her features. Joshua Reynolds, in portraying Georgiana, did the same, his brush capturing the faint yet deliberate shadow that made her expression so legible. These images traveled far beyond the reach of their sitters, reproduced in prints and engravings, studied by aspiring beauties who longed to replicate not only the fashions of dress but the subtleties of the face. Fashion periodicals and gossip sheets fed the craze. The Ladies' Magazine in England and Le Mercure Galant in France did not explicitly endorse mouse skin brows. Decorum prevented them from dwelling too openly on the more macabre aspects of their origin, but they hinted at the delicate arches worn by certain celebrated ladies and the perfectly balanced shadows above the eye, which readers understood as code. Meanwhile, satirical pamphlets lampooned the trend, drawing exaggerated brows on caricatures of political enemies, yet even ridicule had the effect of keeping the fashion in the public eye. The appeal of these fashion icons' brows went beyond mere aesthetics. They embodied a cultural ideal. In an age when artifice was celebrated as a sign of refinement, to be seen with perfectly symmetrical, unblemished brows was to declare oneself above the chaos of nature. It was an assertion of control over the body, a visual metaphor for the Enlightenment belief that human reason and ingenuity could improve upon the raw material of the world. Yet there was also a paradox. These same figures, with their impeccable brows, often faced whispers about vanity, frivolity, and deception. Critics accused them of hiding behind artifice, of creating beauty at the expense of authenticity. But for the icons themselves, beauty was never about authenticity. It was about performance, and performance was the currency of influence. Whether hosting political salons, appearing on stage, or simply walking through the Tuileries gardens, they understood that to be seen was to be remembered, and to be remembered was to wield power. Some even weaponized the brow's capacity for reinvention. Georgiana, during her political campaigns in support of the Whigs, was said to adjust the tilt of her brows to soften her image when addressing skeptical crowds. Marie Antoinette, under increasing scrutiny in the years before the Revolution, shifted from the bold arches of her youth to gentler, more subdued shapes that suggested modesty. Whether the gesture was sincere or strategic remains open to debate. Sarah Siddons, meanwhile, kept a collection of brows for different roles, each pair meticulously labeled and stored, ready to transform her face into whatever the script demanded. Over time, the signatures of these figures became shorthand for their personas. To wear a brow in the style of Marie Antoinette was to aspire to regal poise. To mimic Georgiana was to court both admiration and notoriety. To adopt Siddons' theatrical arches was to channel drama and presence. These associations only deepened as portraits and plays immortalized their wearers, ensuring that the brow was not merely a fashion but a symbol. By the final decades of the century, the names of these icons were woven into the marketing of the trend. Brow makers advertised arches à la reine, or in the Devonshire style. And though such claims were not always verifiable, they were irresistible to customers seeking a touch of celebrity. It was the 18th century equivalent of a modern beauty line endorsed by a famous actress or model, proof that the allure of a trend depends as much on who wears it as on what it is. In this way, the mouse skin brow transcended its humble materials. In the hands and on the faces of Europe's fashion leaders, it became a marker of cultural belonging, an accessory as loaded with meaning as any diamond necklace or political pamphlet. These were not mere strips of fur affixed to the skin. They were expressions of identity, tools of persuasion, and emblems of the age's fascination with the mutable self. And so, as the century rolled on, the sight of a perfectly curved, delicately tinted brow carried with it echoes of the figures who had made it famous. Even those who disdained the trend could not entirely escape its influence, for in the salons, theaters, and portraits of the age, the mouse skin brow had found its true stage, framed by the faces of those whose names history would remember. In the 18th century, beauty was not a private affair, it was a public performance, one staged daily in drawing rooms, promenades, and candlelit theaters. To wear mouse skin brows was not merely to adorn oneself, but to participate in a carefully choreographed social ritual. There were rules, unspoken yet rigid, dictating when, where, and how such brows should be worn, adjusted, and displayed. Those who mastered this etiquette moved effortlessly through society's currents. Those who violated it risked whispers, mockery, or outright scandal. The first rule was timing. Artificial brows were not for morning wear, at least not in polite company. Mornings, by convention, were reserved for a softer presentation, as daylight was unkind to artifice. Natural brows, however sparse or pale, were considered more appropriate for the hours before noon, particularly during informal domestic activities. It was said that even Marie Antoinette would receive her hairdresser in the early hours without her mouse skin brows affixed, reserving them for the later rituals of the day when sunlight gave way to flattering shadow. This rule was as much about optics as about propriety. The less artifice one revealed under the harsh clarity of daylight, the more convincing the transformation when evening came. The second rule concerned the occasion. In the rigid hierarchy of social events, not all demanded the full arsenal of beauty enhancements. A simple afternoon tea with a few trusted friends might permit bare brows or a subtler, lighter pair, perhaps trimmed from softer fur and tinted only faintly. Conversely, a court presentation, the opera, or a high-stakes salon debate demanded the most flawless and symmetrical arches, chosen to complement not only one's face, but also one's gown, hairstyle, and even the political or social impression one wished to leave. A duchess attending the theater might choose a slightly higher arch to convey alertness and wit. A widow in semi-mourning might soften the brows tilt to reflect dignified restraint. Equally important was the art of attachment. The adhesives of the period, gum arabic, fish glue, and other concoctions, were temperamental, and the placement of brows was an exercise in precision. The fashionable woman, or man, did not risk applying them alone. Instead, a trusted maid or valet, skilled in the delicate geometry of the face, would position them so that they mirrored each other perfectly. A misaligned brow was a catastrophe, the subject of instant gossip. One French etiquette manual advised that a lady's brow should be no more aware of its own separation from her skin than the moon is of the ocean's tide, meaning the illusion must be absolute. Once in place, there were rules about touching. To adjust one's brows in public was an intimate act, akin to adjusting one's garter. Acceptable only in the privacy of one's dressing room or with the assistance of a confidant behind the discreet shield of a folding screen. If a brow became loose during a ball or dinner, the well-trained socialite would excuse herself with an elegant pretext, perhaps to admire the moonlight on the balcony, while her maid quietly made the repair. To lose a brow entirely in public, allowing it to slip unnoticed into a soup bowl or onto the marble floor, was a disaster from which reputations could take weeks to recover. Then there was the matter of conversation. A host or hostess wearing mouse skin brows had to manage facial expressions with particular care. Overly animated laughter or an expressive arching of the brows risked loosening the adhesive. Subtlety was the key. A slight lift of one brow to convey amusement, a controlled dip to express sympathy, a measured tilt to signal skepticism. The true mistress of the art could hold an entire unspoken dialogue in these minute shifts, all while keeping her brows firmly in place. Lighting, too, was part of the etiquette. In candlelit rooms, mouse skin brows were at their most convincing, casting a gentle shadow that blended seamlessly into the powdered forehead. In harsh daylight, however, the fur's texture could betray its origins. Thus, those with the means ensured that daytime encounters took place in shaded parlors, gardens dappled with foliage, or under the soft diffusion of muslin-draped windows. The placement of candles at evening gatherings was also strategic. Too much light from above could flatten the brow's natural illusion, while light from below could make them appear exaggerated or theatrical. The color of the brows was a subtle language all its own. Darker brows suggested strength and vivacity, lighter brows, softness and delicacy. A lady in a deep-colored gown might choose brows of slightly deeper hue to anchor her features, while one in pale silks might select a pair with a faint golden tint to harmonize with her attire. Some daring souls, inspired by theatrical fashion, matched the tint of their brows to the powdered shade of their wig, blue, lavender, or even pale pink. Though such choices were considered risque outside of masquerades. Perhaps the most complex etiquette revolved around the question of disclosure. Among close friends, it was acceptable to admit, playfully and in confidence, that one's brows were of mouse skin. Indeed, such admissions could form a kind of camaraderie, an acknowledgement that beauty was an artifice in which all participants were complicit. In mixed company, however, the fiction of natural perfection was maintained. A gentleman might compliment a lady's expressive brows, and she would accept the praise with gracious modesty, never hinting at the craftsman or animal from which they came. The best-worn brows, it was said, were those whose origins remained unspoken. Etiquette also dictated the life cycle of a pair of brows. They were not worn indefinitely. As the fur lost its softness or the tint faded, they were retired, sometimes ceremoniously, to a small velvet-lined box. It was considered unlucky to throw them away in an undignified manner. Some women even kept their old brows as keepsakes, a private archive of past seasons and phases of life. The superstitious whispered that to discard a pair carelessly invited ill fortune, as though the brows retained a fragment of the wearer's essence. This intricate dance of timing, occasion, placement, expression, lighting, color, and secrecy made the wearing of mouse skin brows less a casual beauty choice than an elite social performance. It was a performance reinforced by the community. Hostesses provided the right lighting, portraitists painted them as if they were natural, and friends colluded in maintaining the illusion. To break the etiquette, by wearing them to the wrong event, adjusting them openly, or allowing them to fall, was to risk undermining not just one's own dignity, but the collective agreement that upheld the beauty ideals of the age. And yet, the rules were not entirely rigid. The most influential figures, the queens, duchesses, and celebrated actresses, could bend them to their will. Marie Antoinette, on certain mornings, was known to appear in her gardens in full court brows, defying the daylight rule to create an aura of otherworldly perfection. Georgiana Cavendish, with her wit and charm, could draw laughter rather than scorn if a brow slipped during a ball. Sarah Siddons, on stage, would deliberately exaggerate the arc or darkness of her brows to suit the scene, flouting the conventions of subtlety because the theater demanded it. This flexibility for the few only reinforced the hierarchy. The more exalted one's social position, the more one could disregard the rules without consequence. For the rest, conformity was essential, for the brow was a passport into polite society, and etiquette was the border guard. Thus, in the grand salons and opera houses of 18th century Europe, the mouse skin brow was never just a strip of fur affixed above the eye. It was a symbol of one's mastery over the codes of appearance, a mark of belonging to a world in which beauty was as deliberate, as constructed, and as rule-bound as any diplomatic treaty or courtly dance. To wear them correctly was to speak fluently in the language of elegance. To wear them poorly was to betray oneself as an amateur in the theater of life. Behind every trend in history, there is an economy quietly humming, an intricate network of suppliers, craftsmen, merchants, and consumers whose fortunes rise and fall with the fickle winds of taste. The 18th century fashion for mouse skin eyebrows was no exception. What, to the casual observer, seemed a mere novelty in beauty culture was in truth the product of a surprisingly complex market, one that connected the humblest pest catcher to the grandest court in Europe. The raw material, mouse skin, was the first point of the economic chain. In rural areas, mice were common nuisances, their proliferation in barns and storehouses both a curse and, unexpectedly, a source of revenue. Farmers and laborers who once disposed of them without a second thought began to see value in the small, fine-furred pelts. Mice with soft, fine hair, particularly in shades of gray, brown, or black, were most prized. The fur's texture, naturally short and delicate, mimicked human eyebrow hair more convincingly than that of larger animals. By the mid-18th century, a cottage industry had formed. In the countryside of France, Britain, and parts of Germany, trappers sold bundles of pelts to intermediaries, who then passed them along to furriers in the cities. These urban furriers had the skill to treat the skins, scraping, curing, and softening them to prevent decay. Preservation was essential, for an untreated mouse pelt would quickly rot or stiffen, rendering it useless for fashion. The treatment process itself was a guarded trade secret, and the best artisans could command higher prices for their expertly prepared fur. From there, the materials entered the hands of the eyebrow makers, a small but specialized branch of the broader wig and hairpiece-making trade. These craftsmen, often working in the same districts as perruquiers, wig makers, would cut and shape the treated mouse fur into delicate arches. The precision required was extraordinary. The smallest asymmetry could render the final product unflattering. Some workshops prided themselves on offering custom brows, shaped according to an individual's facial proportions, while others sold standard patterns in a range of sizes and thicknesses. The application of dye was another stage in the value chain. While natural fur colors often sufficed, the demand for perfect matches to one's hair or wig meant that dyeing was common. Eyebrow makers used vegetable dyes, lampblack, or a mix of iron oxide and vinegar to achieve the desired shade. More adventurous clients might request auburn, golden, or even powdered white brows to complement theatrical wigs. Each added step increased the price, and the most elaborate commissions, featuring subtly graduated tones or decorative accents for masquerades, were luxury items accessible only to the wealthy elite. Pricing varied widely. A basic pair of mouse skin brows might cost the equivalent of a week's wages for a domestic servant, placing them within reach for those aspiring to upward mobility but still representing a significant investment. High-end pairs, crafted by renowned artisans in Paris or London, could cost as much as a month's income for a skilled tradesman. For the aristocracy, such sums were trivial, and the acquisition of multiple pairs for different occasions was part of maintaining an image of constant novelty and refinement. This disparity in affordability created a visible economic divide. Among the wealthy, brows were symbols of refined taste. Among the lower classes who could manage only a single pair, often worn beyond their intended lifespan, they could be symbols of aspiration. The second-hand market was, inevitably, born from this gap. Just as with wigs and fine clothing, mouse skin brows could be resold or traded when no longer fashionable to their original owner. Street markets in larger cities occasionally featured lightly worn pairs, though these carried the stigma of reduced quality and questionable hygiene. Some glamorous, some humble, all bound together by the curious economics of fashion. The eyebrow trade also intersected with other booming industries of the century, particularly cosmetics and personal grooming. Adhesives, for instance, were a recurring expense. Gum arabic, fish glue, and other fixatives were sold by apothecaries, often packaged with small brushes for application. Some beauty merchants offered brow kits that included a pair of brows, adhesive, a storage box, and a tiny comb for grooming the fur. These kits were marketed as modern conveniences, appealing to both seasoned socialites and young women entering society. The theater world was another major customer. Actors and actresses, constantly in need of expressive features visible even from the back rows, relied heavily on mouse skin brows for stage work. Theatrical costumers bought in bulk, sometimes commissioning exaggerated shapes for comedic effect or bold arches for tragedy. The stage demand helped stabilize the industry during times when aristocratic fashion temporarily shifted elsewhere. But like all markets tied to fashion, the eyebrow trade was vulnerable to volatility. Political and economic crises could dampen demand. During the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763, for example, disruptions in trade and increased taxation led to a noticeable decline in luxury purchases among the middle classes. The wealthy continued to buy, but in smaller quantities, and the less affluent often had to make do with old or repaired brows. Workshops adapted by diversifying into related products, such as false eyelashes made from silk threads or animal hair. Paris, London, and Vienna emerged as the leading centers of eyebrow fashion. Each city had its own style and marketing approach. Parisian makers emphasized artistry, offering brows that mimicked the soft, natural irregularity of real hair. London's craftsmen leaned toward precision and uniformity, catering to the British preference for order and symmetry. Vienna's workshops, influenced by its vibrant masquerade culture, produced more flamboyant shapes and colors for costume balls. Advertising for these products was discreet but effective. Small printed trade cards, often beautifully engraved, circulated among fashionable clients. These cards might depict a finely dressed lady in profile, her brows perfectly arched, with the maker's name and address subtly printed beneath. Some eyebrow makers relied on word-of-mouth recommendations from hairdressers, milliners, and perfumers, who acted as intermediaries in the broader beauty economy. By the latter part of the century, the eyebrow trade had become sufficiently established that some makers achieved celebrity status. Names like Jean-Baptiste Louvier in Paris or Miss Hartwell in London appeared in society gossip columns, their clients boasting of custom pairs made by the famous hand. These artisans charged accordingly, sometimes tripling their rates for rush orders before major court events. The economic impact of mouse skin brows extended beyond the immediate trade. It supported jobs in pest control, for preparation, dye production, retail, and even shipping, as pelts moved from rural traps to urban workshops. In this way, a trend that began as a niche novelty became a microeconomy woven into the fabric of 18th-century urban life. Yet, this prosperity carried an inherent risk, dependence on the whims of fashion. By the final decades of the century, shifts in aesthetic sensibilities, driven by Enlightenment ideals of natural beauty and by satirical attacks in print, began to erode the market. Publications mocked the absurdity of wearing rodent fur on one's face, and some moralists condemned it as a symbol of vanity disconnected from the virtues of simplicity and reason. These criticisms, coupled with the social upheavals of the French Revolution, caused a marked decline in demand by the 1790s. Still, for several glittering decades, mouse skin eyebrows were not merely adornments. They were commodities in a thriving, if peculiar, luxury trade. They illustrated the intersection of beauty and commerce, where every arc of fur represented not just an aesthetic choice, but the labor of many hands, the exchange of many coins, and the aspirations of many lives. In the gilded world of 18th-century fashion, no trend could survive indefinitely without attracting the barbed quills of satirists. The mouse skin eyebrow craze, which had once been the quiet darling of high society, became, by the 1760s and 1770s, a lightning rod for mockery, moral outrage, and scandal. In the salons of Paris, the coffee houses of London, and the pamphlet stalls of Vienna, the image of a powdered lady with delicate arches of rodent fur became an irresistible target. Caricaturists were the first to seize on the absurdity. The London printmakers, ever keen to expose the follies of the fashionable, produced exaggerated engravings of society women whose eyebrows, oversized, bushy, or drooping, seemed ready to detach and crawl away. One popular etching by satirist Matthew Darley depicted a grand dame at a ball, her brows sliding down her cheeks in the heat, as a horrified suitor looked on. Beneath the image, the caption read, "The perils of the petticoat pest." In Paris, The engraver Charles Germain de Saint-Aubin sketched a scene in which a maid chased a mouse across the boudoir, only for her mistress to cry out, "Spare it! I've an appointment with my perruquier." Pamphleteers joined in with biting essays and mock advice columns. In Britain's The Town and Country magazine, one anonymous writer advised ladies to keep their brows in a cedar box, lest moths, those tiny anarchists, make merry upon them. French satirists, inspired by the Enlightenment's disdain for artifice, condemned the fad as emblematic of a decadent aristocracy obsessed with surfaces while ignoring substance. These attacks often linked mouse skin brows to larger critiques of courtly excess, making them a symbol not just of vanity, but of moral decay. Scandal soon followed satire, for where there is ridicule, there is often revelation. In 1772, a whispering scandal emerged in London when it was alleged that several prominent ladies had suffered embarrassing brow losses during a particularly humid court gathering. The details, reported gleefully in the gossip sheets, were damning. Perspiration had loosened the gum Arabic adhesive, sending several pairs of brows sliding mid-conversation. One lady was said to have attempted to press them back in place while bowing to the king, resulting in a crooked, almost comical expression immortalized in multiple caricatures. Whether true or exaggerated, the tale spread quickly, reinforcing public perception of the brows as fragile, impractical, and faintly ridiculous. Moralists were quick to seize on such incidents. In sermons and essays, clergymen condemned the practice as an affront to divine creation. "The Almighty gave thee thy visage," one preacher thundered from a London pulpit, "and thou, in thy folly, dost graft the hide of vermin upon it." In more puritanical circles, the use of mouse skin brows was even equated with deceit, the artificial enhancement of the face seen as a form of social dishonesty. Yet, the backlash was not purely moralistic. Enlightenment thinkers, who championed the ideals of reason and nature, found in the trend a convenient case study in the irrationality of fashion. Philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, though never directly mentioning mouse skin brows, railed against the excesses of aristocratic appearance, arguing that true beauty lay in unadorned authenticity. In salons, debates arose over whether beauty should be improved by artifice or left to its natural form. Mouse skin eyebrows, with their peculiar origin and obvious artificiality, were held up as a perfect example of the unnatural. Playwrights also joined the chorus of criticism. In comedies performed at London's Drury Lane and Covent Garden, sharp-tongued heroines mocked rivals for wearing the brow of another creature. In one particularly popular farce, The Mouse Above the Eye, the plot hinged on a case of mistaken identity after two women swapped eyebrows in a dimly lit dressing room. The audience roared with laughter, and the play's satirical bite was unmistakable. Fashions so contrived, it suggested, were inherently farcical. This rising tide of ridicule had measurable effects on the industry. Artisans who once advertised openly began to do so discreetly, relying on private referrals to avoid attracting unwanted attention. Some attempted to rebrand, marketing their wares as natural hair brows without disclosing the mouse skin origins. Others diversified into different beauty products, anticipating that the eyebrow fad might collapse entirely under the weight of public scorn. Yet, for all the mockery, the trend persisted, if only among the most stubborn devotees. Fashion, after all, has a curious resilience, and ridicule often serves only to deepen the allure for those determined to distinguish themselves from the common crowd. Indeed, in certain elite circles, wearing mouse skin brows in the face of public derision became a statement of defiance, a declaration that one was above the petty judgments of the masses. Still, the attacks took their toll. The final decades of the 18th century were marked by political and cultural shifts that made such conspicuous luxury dangerous. The French Revolution in particular transformed the landscape of fashion, as aristocratic symbols became liabilities rather than assets. Satirical pamphlets from revolutionary Paris gleefully portrayed the condemned nobility, with their brows tumbling into the basket alongside their powdered wigs. In such a climate, the mouse skin brow ceased to be merely a subject of amusement. It became a relic of a despised order. By the early 19th century, the trend had faded almost entirely, surviving only in theatrical costuming and certain rural traditions where satirical winds had not blown so fiercely. But its legacy as a cautionary tale of fashion's susceptibility to scandal endured. Historians of costume would later marvel at how such a small, almost absurd accessory could become a cultural flashpoint, illustrating the volatile interplay between personal adornment, public opinion, and political upheaval. The backlash against mouse skin eyebrows was thus more than a matter of mockery. It was a lesson in the fragility of fashion when confronted with changing values and the power of public discourse. What began as a whimsical adornment had, through the sharp pens of satirists and the whispers of scandal, become an emblem of vanity's vulnerability. In that transformation lay the final irony. The very feature meant to perfect a woman's face had, in the end, exposed the imperfections of an entire age. By the dawn of the 19th century, the mouse skin eyebrow was no longer a novelty. It was an anachronism. The forces that had propelled it into vogue, courtly influence, competitive display, and the 18th century's indulgence in artifice, had been overturned by revolution, war, and the rising ethos of naturalism. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, Europe's social and aesthetic climate shifted sharply. The powdered wigs, towering coiffures, and jeweled accessories that had once dominated the salons of Paris and London were now seen by many as dangerous markers of aristocratic excess. In such an atmosphere, an eyebrow made from the pelt of a rodent seemed not only frivolous but perilously out of touch with the new order. The transition was not instantaneous. In pockets of the continent untouched by radical change, smaller courts in German principalities, certain provincial towns in Italy, the practice lingered for a time. Here, mouse skin brows persisted as part of a wider adherence to the older fashions, sometimes worn alongside powdered hair and brocade gowns well into the 1810s. But the great capitals, trendsetters in earlier decades, had moved on. In Paris, under the Directory and later Napoleon's empire, beauty was redefined. The neoclassical aesthetic, with its reverence for ancient Rome and Greece, emphasized clean lines, soft curls, and the unpainted brow. Where the 18th century had celebrated artifice, the early 19th century began to prize a cultivated version of the natural. Even in England, where traditions often held longer, the decline was evident. By 1805, advertisements for mouse skin brows had all but disappeared from fashionable papers. The artisans who had supplied them either turned to wigs, theatrical props, or new forms of eyebrow enhancement using human hair. A few stubborn adherents remained, clinging to their brows as one might to an old perfume, a private link to a past era. But the social incentive had evaporated. What had once been a badge of refinement now risked becoming a mark of ridicule. The decline was helped along by technological and cosmetic innovations. By the early 19th century, eyebrow pomades, tints, and pencils were becoming more accessible, allowing women to darken and shape their natural brows rather than replace them altogether. The art of cosmetic enhancement had not died, it had simply evolved. The mouse skin brow, with its fiddly preparation, fragility, and animal origins, could not compete with a little coal or a deft stroke of charcoal. Yet, the disappearance of mouse skin brows was not complete. They found a strange afterlife in the theater. Stage actors and actresses, particularly in historical or comic roles, sometimes wore exaggerated mouse skin brows to achieve period accuracy or to satirize past fashions. In pantomimes and farces, the comically misplaced or slipping brow became a shorthand for vanity, deceit, or outdated pretension. In this way, the trend was preserved not as a living fashion, but as a relic, a costume piece embodying the follies of a bygone age. Historians and antiquarians of the Victorian era would occasionally encounter references to the practice in letters, memoirs, and satirical prints. For them, mouse skin brows were part of a larger fascination with 18th century excess. They became a favorite example in lectures and essays warning against the tyranny of fashion, illustrating how the desire to conform to beauty ideals could lead to absurd extremes. By the late 19th century, collectors began to seek out original examples. Though few survived, the organic materials and delicate construction meant that most disintegrated over time. A handful of preserved specimens, flattened, faded, and brittle, eventually found their way into museums of costume and curiosities, where they drew both fascination and revulsion from visitors. Modern echoes of the trend are not always obvious, yet they are there. In the 20th century, false eyebrows made a quiet return in the world of film and high-fashion photography, where makeup artists experimented with applique designs made from feathers, lace, or synthetic fibers. These were not intended for everyday wear but for artistic effect, and the lineage, however distant, could be traced back to the mouse skin of the 18th century. In the avant-garde fashion shows of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, designers occasionally sent models down the runway with elaborate false brows, some sparkling with crystals, others crafted from unconventional materials, as a deliberate provocation. Few in the audience realized that such spectacles had an ancestor in the drawing rooms of Enlightenment Europe. In the age of social media, the mouse skin brow has even enjoyed brief moments of renewed attention, not as a serious beauty option, but as a historical curiosity. Beauty vloggers and costume historians have filmed themselves recreating the look, using faux fur or other safe materials, as a way to explore past aesthetics. These videos, while playful, also serve as commentary on the cyclical nature of beauty trends. Viewers laugh, marvel, and sometimes confess that the look is not as bad as they imagined, revealing how the line between ridicule and admiration can blur across centuries. And yet, for all its strangeness, the mouse skin brow story holds a certain resonance today. Its rise and fall encapsulate the interplay of personal expression, societal expectation, and technological limitation. In the 18th century, a woman without natural brows had few options. Mouse skin, however odd it might seem to us now, was a practical solution that also aligned with the beauty ideals of the time. The ridicule that eventually engulfed the trend was not simply about the object itself, but about the shifting values of society. Values that determined what was tasteful, what was laughable, and what was condemned. The disappearance of the mouse skin brow also speaks to the fragility of trends tied too closely to a specific social class. Because the brows were most associated with the aristocracy and fashionable elite, they became vulnerable when those groups lost cultural dominance. What might have endured as a niche beauty aid instead became a symbol of a fallen world, swept away by the tides of political and cultural change. Today, in the climate-controlled vaults of fashion archives, the few surviving examples rest in small, labeled boxes. They are no longer objects of beauty, nor of ridicule, but of study. Museum placards describe their construction: thin strips of tanned mouse hide, dyed and cut to shape, with fine hairs left intact, and their cultural context, noting their place in the larger story of 18th-century cosmetics. Visitors peer in, some amused, others faintly horrified, but all reminded of the strange lengths to which humans will go in pursuit of beauty. The slow disappearance of the mouse skin brow was not an abrupt ending but a gentle fading, a quiet retreat from the public face into the margins of history. It is a reminder that fashions are not always vanquished by ridicule alone. Sometimes they simply wither when the world around them changes, leaving behind little more than traces in old prints, forgotten boxes, and the footnotes of fashion history. And in those traces lies the final irony. Though no one wears them today, the mouse skin brow survives in the cultural imagination, summoned whenever we think of the most outlandish beauty trends of the past. They are a ghost adornment, invisible yet enduring, still arching across the centuries in the mind's eye. The story of the 18th century mouse skin eyebrow is, at first glance, a curiosity, an oddity pulled from the dusty cabinet of fashion history. Yet, like so many seemingly trivial artifacts, it reflects something deeper about the society that created it and the human beings who embraced it. These slender strips of fur, plucked from the humblest of creatures and reshaped into a symbol of refinement, tell us about the collision of necessity and artifice, of status and insecurity, of innovation and absurdity. They remind us that beauty is never just about appearance. It is about power, belonging, and the relentless human urge to transform the self. In their time, mouse skin eyebrows were not ridiculous. They were a practical answer to a problem: how to restore what disease, age, or misfortune had taken away. The 18th century offered no microblading, no cosmetic tattooing, no synthetic hairpieces of today's durability. What it had was ingenuity, craft, and a willingness to embrace the unnatural if it created the illusion of perfection. In the courtly circles of Europe, appearance was currency. Every detail, from the slope of a wig to the arch of a brow, signaled taste, wealth, and social standing. In that world, a bare brow could be more than a cosmetic flaw. It could be a social liability. The rise of the mouse skin brow is thus a reminder of how quickly human adaptation can slide into human excess. What began as a discreet corrective became a public fashion, with brows sometimes shaped into exaggerated curves that bore little resemblance to nature. The satire of the time, the caricatures, the biting pamphlets, was not aimed at the practicality of the invention, but at the vanity it exposed. It is the same cycle that has repeated across centuries. A beauty innovation emerges, it gains acceptance, it is exaggerated to the point of absurdity, and finally, it collapses under the weight of its own artifice. Its fall was swift not because it was impractical, it had been impractical from the start, but because the society that supported it vanished. The French Revolution swept away not only monarchies and aristocrats, but the elaborate visual codes by which they communicated. In the new political and cultural climates of the 19th century, the elaborate performance of beauty gave way to a cultivated naturalism. The mouse skin brow, bound up with the powdered heads and embroidered gowns of the old regime, could not survive in an age that sought to reject its symbols wholesale. And yet, fashions never truly die. They linger in memory, in satire, in revival. In the case of mouse skin eyebrows, their resurrection has been fragmentary, appearing in theater, in costume dramas, in academic lectures on historical beauty. They reappear as both a joke and a point of fascination in modern media, where they are often presented with a mixture of mockery and awe. In these moments, the brows become more than just a fashion relic. They become a mirror, reflecting our own beauty rituals back to us in strange and unsettling ways. What might future generations say of our own enhancements? The eyebrow tattoos, the laminated brows, the sculpted arches that dominate Instagram feeds. Will they too be placed in museum cases, provoking laughter and disbelief? History suggests they will. For all our technological progress, the impulse behind them is unchanged. The desire to control the impression we make upon others, to refine the raw materials of the self into something that feels closer to our ideal. This is why the mouse skin brow deserves to be remembered, not merely as a quaint eccentricity of the Enlightenment, but as part of a continuum of human behavior. Fashion is not a frivolous sideline to history. It is a record of values, anxieties, and aspirations. It shows how people navigate the distance between who they are and who they wish to appear to be. It charts the shifting boundaries between the acceptable and the absurd. In the end, the mouse skin brow is both a product of its time and a timeless lesson. It warns us that beauty, pursued without restraint, can become its own parody. It reminds us that trends are not fixed points but moving currents, and that what seems desirable now may, in the space of a generation, seem outlandish. And it affirms that no matter the material, whether it is fur from a mouse or pigment from a modern factory, the human impulse to adorn, to enhance, to rewrite the body's script will find a way. Today, in a handful of museum drawers, these fragile remnants lie preserved, tiny arcs of fur, once worn proudly above the eyes of Europe's most fashionable women. They are silent now, stripped of their original purpose, yet they still speak. To the historians who study them, to the visitors who marvel at them, and to anyone who has ever looked in a mirror and wondered what could be improved. In that moment of reflection, we are not so far from the salons of the 18th century, from the flicker of candlelight on powder and silk, from the hand reaching to adjust a brow that was never truly one's own. The mouse skin eyebrow may have vanished from our faces, but it has not vanished from our story. It arches still, faint but unbroken, across the long span of human vanity and invention.